This is not a spoiler-free discussion. In fact, it is the exact opposite. This video will be delving headfirst into the recent DLC announcements for Final Fantasy VII Remake, the Yuffie chapter officially titled Intermission. It's taken me some time to get this video out because there's just so much that needs to be explained. A lot of context that I needed to give myself through once again studying the compilation and the Ultimanias, as well as go over the events of Remake, as well as study the Famitsu article released for Intermission. Most of the things we're going to talk about today are things that we have hardly covered on this channel so far, and some things we are all too familiar with. And for that reason alone, I am very excited to talk about what I have found. Now, in order to understand the full scope of Intergrade's story, you need to understand one fundamental thing. Intermission's story has already started and concluded in the time frame in which Remake takes place, as the DLC is told alongside the main story. From what I can tell, Intergrade's story covers the entirety of the day in which Cloud meets Aerith, to the very end of Remake, up until the point of the end events that take place in Shinra HQ, meaning that Intermission's events and the actions taken by the characters involved in both the DLC and the main story have a direct effect on one another. And let me tell you, there is a lot of cause and effect already present in Remake and Intermission story so far. Not only are the two connected to each other, they are also connected to a pre-existing history set up by the compilation. And for this reason, we can actually do a fair amount of work to determine the story of the DLC before the game even comes out. And while you may think I am only talking about the connection between the events of Remake story and Intermission story, this game is doing so much more than just that, as it sets up for what we have known Remake to be all along. The sequel to the compilation. Everything that I have talked about from the structure of 5 video series is beginning to come true. To give each game in the compilation its chance to see through all that it had to offer to the end, and I mean quite literally everything, which in my mind makes this DLC not only necessary for the story of Remake Part 1, but also will be the shining example of how Remake plans to express the future of the compilation, and how it will unite with Remake, as Intermission takes on the task of delving into Before Crisis, a mobile game that covers the entirety of Avalanche's history and its conflict with Shinra, as well as Dirge of Cerberus, not only its main story, but its online multiplayer story mode, which covers the events of Deepground before the events of Dirge of Cerberus. All of these games are being told, being expanded on, or being given their sequels. And of course, this all comes together with Dirge of Cerberus's secret cutscene. So in order to understand what Intermission is doing with the compilation, you need to understand the specific groups of characters in Intermission that come into play, and the history behind them, as all of them shape each other over the course of Final Fantasy VII's history. These parties being Barret's Avalanche, which is made up of Barret, Biggs, Wedge, Jessie, Tifa, and now Cloud. Avalanche HQ, made up of Nayo, Polk, Billy Bob, and Jujie. Wutai, which comprises Yuffie and Sonon. Shinra, with Rufus and the Turks. And of course, Deepground, with Vice and many others. And let's not forget Genesis. So in order to get the perspective we need to be looking at the timeline of Final Fantasy VII's events, for both Before Crisis and Dirge of Cerberus's online story mode. And then we are going to go over each of their story beats and how they apply to Remake and Intermission with that newfound context. And once all of that is said and done, we will talk about what we can expect to see in Intermission, events and characters alike. Then we can talk about how Intergrade as a whole sits in the context of the compilation, and how it acts as a successor to the compilation's events, all in an effort to explain exactly how all of what we learned connects perfectly to create the most accurate understanding of what we can expect of the future of Remake. But before we do any of that, I need to restore legitimacy to one particular game mentioned and give it validity for its use in the canon timeline of Remake.
わかった。すぐ行く。
Zirconiade. Why are we talking about the final boss of Before Crisis, and how does Zirconiade have anything to do with the history of the above groups mentioned? As we know, Before Crisis was a game that covered the events of Avalanche's inception, growth, and eventual defeat, as well as the beginning and end of Avalanche's conflict with Shinra. These events taking place far before the events of Remake, and ending right before Remake's beginning. Before Crisis also establishes a lot of key characters that are influential to the story of Final Fantasy VII overall. Veld, the former leader of the Turks, Rufus and his involvement with Avalanche, Elf, and Vegito, the founders of Avalanche, just to name a few. But there is one event in particular in Before Crisis that was extremely important. The event of Zirconiade's summoning. This moment in Before Crisis was so crucial, as it depicted a lot of the final events of that game, and concluded a lot of the story elements introduced, as well as set up for quite a bit of story that had yet to come to fruition, including the Avalanche leaders' deaths, Elf's survival, and Rufus's involvement with both of these events directly. Being that the story of Before Crisis took place before the events of the original game, Before Crisis provided an interesting perspective on the original game, but because of the timing in which the compilation was made, which was after the original game, the events of Before Crisis did not flow into the original, leaving many of the loose ends made by its story unresolved. This made a game like Remake the perfect opportunity to elaborate and expand on those loose ends. As we know from the events of Remake, that seemed to be something that Remake was already doing. An easy example of this being the attempt on the president's life, an event that takes place very early on in Before Crisis. Another example being Remake's efforts to expand on Avalanche outside of Barret's group. But a lot of people, including myself, saw Zirconiade's inclusion in Remake as being more or less problematic, and that was because Zirconiade seemed to be retconned to a significant degree. This was because Zirconiade was summoned over Midgar, specifically over the Sector 6 plate, in the month before Remake took place, which, according to many sources, this summoning destroyed the Sector 6 plate. For those who don't know, Sector 6 does not have a top plate in OG or in Remake. This event in Before Crisis explained exactly how that came to pass. But as we came to find out, there was a lot of conflicting information that came to light in Remake to discredit that lore. Because Aerith in Remake, as well as quotes from the recent Material Ultimania, mention an incident with Sector 6's plate that predated Zirconiade's summoning. And rather than the plate falling in the year 7 through Zirconiade, the Sector 6 plate actually collapsed because of an accident taking place in 1976, 30 years before Zirconiade was summoned. 1976, 6th plate collapse accident. A plate collapse accidentally occurred on the 6th plate. The cause of the accident seemed to occur due to the load on the upper layer of the plate. Fortunately, immigration to the 6th plate had not started and there were few casualties. However, the plate collapsed entirely. The area under the plate becomes impassable due to rubble. The restoration was delayed due to a lack of budget from Shinra being allocated, and at the beginning of the story, Remake, the ruins still remain in place. This meant that to many of us, because of this new development in Remake, Zirconiade's summoning just ceased to exist in Remake, and that because of this new lore conflicting with the old, it called into question how much of Before Crisis actually took place in this new retelling of Final Fantasy VII, as so much hinged on the events that led up to Zirconiade's summoning as well as its inevitable defeat. Hell, entire characters and major plot elements hinged on Zirconiade's inclusion. How much of it had been remade to fit the story of Remake? And because of this forceful removal of just one summon, no one, including myself, could say for certain how much of Before Crisis was or wasn't valid to talk about. All of these newer additions could be just chalked up to nods or just new elements introduced in Remake. That all changed after some digging on my part, as this supposed fact of Zirconiade's involvement in Sector 6's destruction is actually a complete fabrication. The evidence for Zirconiade causing the collapse just doesn't exist. And what actually happened was that a theory turned into reality. This, I am sure, happened through a telephone effect of different people who, like myself, did not do the necessary research to find the origin of this made-up idea, and turned it into a lore fact. And you're never gonna guess who created this theory to begin with. M.J. Gallagher, the author of several Final Fantasy VII books that I have promoted on this channel, which, by the way, check them out, was the person who created this theory. I went ahead and confirmed this with him, and not only that, I even found a post where he clarified that this was a theory in 2010. He goes on to say that this theory had no basis in any lore, but rather was a fun theory, and I quote, based off of an observation in the Zirconiade Before Crisis cutscene in which the alleged damage to Sector 6's plate was caused by storms generated by Zirconiade's summoning, rather than Zirconiade herself. The theory was made before any solid evidence of Sector 6's collapse was discovered, released, or elaborated on by Square. With that, a huge splinter in Before Crisis's side has been removed, which allows us to definitively say that Before Crisis's events in its entirety seem to be canon. Nothing in either Remake or the compilation conflicts in any way at this point, to my knowledge, that is substantial enough to contradict the main events of Before Crisis in any way. With Before Crisis reinstated into its rightful place, we are going to go over the history of Avalanche, starting with the events that take place prior to OG or to Remake. It is disclosed in the world preview for Remake a timeline of canon events. These events cover most of the compilation's history, as well as key moments we know from the original Final Fantasy VII. This timeline mentions several key things that we need to keep in mind moving forward into intermission. Starting off with the inception of Avalanche and the people responsible for its creation, as well as the location of its original headquarters. The birth of Avalanche. Within the time frame of the first 2 months of the new year, the year 1, a planetologist from Cosmo Canyon forms Avalanche. This newly formed group then occupies a building in Wutai. This Wutai base becomes the official headquarters of Avalanche. The events of this Wutai headquarters inception and the planetologist who created Avalanche have been mentioned countless times in different timelines provided in several different Ultimanias, but the phrasing here and the timing of the events of this particular mention in the world preview book for Remake illustrates a much closer grouping of events than any other Ultimania so far. This is because we have a marker of events in between the beginning of the year 1 and an event that takes place involving Avalanche exactly 2 months and 30 days after that. This event being the attack on both Midgar and Junon. As we also know from Before Crisis, this attack on Midgar and Junon is also the official reveal of Avalanche to Shinra as a group, as Shinra is unaware of the name of this new terrorist group at that moment in time. This gives us a very clear idea as to how Avalanche was created. That means that within just 2 months and 30 days in the year 1, Avalanche was born, established its headquarters in Wutai, and then begins attacking Shinra. This means that the founders of Avalanche would be the leaders of Avalanche established in Before Crisis, something that we have never really been able to clarify until now. This means that the mentioned planetologist in the timeline only has one real candidate, and that being one of the leaders of Avalanche, Vegito, having studied directly under Bugenhagen in Cosmo Canyon. So, according to the lore, Vegito created Avalanche, but Elf, another leader of Avalanche, would have also been instrumental in the creation of this group. Elf states that she was raised by the group that comprises Avalanche, who are also notably planetologists. While she is actually the daughter of Veld, the leader of the Turks, she is separated from him at a very young age, with little memory of her former life. All of these events certainly happened long before the formation of Avalanche. So, from what we know, she was most likely raised in Cosmo Canyon by the other planetologists, all of whom go on with Vegito to become Avalanche, which means not only would she most likely be a planetologist herself, she too would have been directly involved with the inception of Avalanche. Now there is one more person who seems to be involved with Avalanche's creation, but we will get to him very soon. But just know that Vegito and Elf's inclusion it's good stuff. It's important to highlight that Avalanche's base is established in Wutai, not only in the timeline, but this is also highlighted in Before Crisis, as we see Vegito in the early events of that game discussing plans for the Junon attack inside the same Wutai base mentioned in the timeline. And while this relationship with Avalanche and Wutai seems to be minor, there is a much greater context to this relationship in Remake. In Chapter 4, Biggs informs Cloud that Wutai and Avalanche have formed an alliance, Avalanche promising them all of the materia in Midgar. This relationship is then elaborated on in Intermission with Yuffie's appearance. These two recent developments bring a new context to Avalanche and Wutai's relationship in the compilation that we need to look at. Around the time that Avalanche's base is established in Wutai, there is still 2 months before the Wutai War ends, meaning that during the Wutai War, Avalanche and Wutai are both actively trying to destroy Shinra and are also aware of each other's existence. Not only that, but the two seemingly have some sort of informal alliance. To further this connection, it is mentioned later on in Before Crisis, even after the war is over, that Avalanche continues to work out of Wutai. President Shinra and Veld state in a conversation that while the war between Shinra and Wutai is over, Wutai still holds a grudge against the company, which Veld states makes Avalanche's headquarters a very practical location for them to use as their base of operations. Keep this in mind for future events. The other notable event introduced in Remake is the ceasefire. This dialogue comes up between Cloud and Barret during the beginning of their infiltration of Shinra HQ in Remake, stating that there was no official end of the war, but rather a ceasefire. So keep in mind that while the war is seemingly over in many people's minds, it actually hasn't officially ended. And to the contrary, there have been numerous attempts on both sides of the aisle to disrupt that uneasy peace, but no activity to formally reignite war again until Remake. This is where a lot of new development comes in regards to Yuffie through Intermission. It should be mentioned that because of Yuffie's age, all of the events described so far are things that transpire as she is growing up. These events being the Wutai War, the end of the Wutai War, and Avalanche's activities in Wutai and the base's inevitable destruction by the Turks. Some of these events taking place, Yuffie was directly involved in. The timeline of these Yuffie events are the end of the Wutai War with Zack's infiltration of Fort Tamblin in Crisis Core. She appears and then runs off. And Yuffie appears in Chapter 14 in Before Crisis, which takes place after the Wutai War in the year 3. Yuffie is actually involved in the events that lead to Avalanche's headquarters being destroyed, as she accompanies and is saved by your playable Turk. And interestingly enough, according to the timeline, very soon after the destruction of Avalanche's headquarters, Yuffie leaves Wutai to become a self-proclaimed materia hunter. Then, roughly between the end of the Wutai War and the Nibelheim incident, she also appears with her own side missions in Crisis Core, seeking out powerful materia throughout the world of Final Fantasy VII with the help of Zack Fair. This creates a lot of interesting avenues for Yuffie's character. How have these events shaped her? How does she view Avalanche? From what I know of Before Crisis, she doesn't seem to like Avalanche very much, as this sort of sets a mentality that Wutai itself, without the assistance of others, must regain its honor. And what about her experiences with both Shinra and the Turks? As Yuffie has had plenty of interactions with Zack and the playable Turk, it will be interesting to see how the story moves forward with these prior experiences in regards to the larger events in Remake. She has had one other interaction with someone tied to Shinra that is far more compelling, but we will get to that in a moment. Sometime between the year 3, in which she departs from Wutai, and the beginning of Remake, Yuffie finds herself a part of the special force operations of the new Wutai government. I now want to briefly discuss some of the newer developments that come directly into play during Yuffie's introduction in Intermission. Just know that while this is new lore being introduced by Intermission, there are firmly established connections to this new lore in the compilation, and for that reason we need to go over them now. The state of Wutai in Intermission. During her introduction, Yuffie mentions that she is a Special Forces member of the new Wutai government. While you may want to think that this is just some Yuffie shenanigans going on here, like her self-proclaimed title as Materia Hunter, it is important to note that the mission assignment is given to Yuffie directly through the Wutai government. This info is provided in Yuffie's bio from Intergrade. She is currently working to save her hometown after it has lost its luster as a result of the war with Shinra. Yuffie is assigned a secret mission from the new Wutai government and is sent to infiltrate Midgar. The other important note from Yuffie's bio is the mention of Wutai losing its luster. This leads me to believe that we're going to see a very similar Wutai to the one in OG, a sad tourist trap as Yuffie describes it. But taking into account the events of the compilation and this activity we're seeing in Remake, Wutai has been secretly fighting against Shinra. But it is important to note that this particular partnership between Wutai and Avalanche seems to be spurred on by the call to arms from Avalanche, and not the other way around. One character's bio states that Avalanche is attempting to strengthen its relationship with Wutai, and for this reason is assisting Wutai in its efforts to get the ultimate materia from Shinra. This relationship Avalanche is establishing with Wutai is way more important than you know, as it will give us the full scope of how interconnected each party is to each other. But before we can do that, you need to understand why the materia is so important to Wutai. While Yuffie is the known materia thief, she shares this same fascination for materia with her father. This is exemplified at the end of Yuffie's side mission in the OG, in which she confronts her father in Wutai on her own and defeats him, in which Godo tells Yuffie to continue with the group to restore Wutai honor. But as the group leaves, Godo pulls Yuffie aside to tell her to make sure that after the journey with Cloud and the party is complete, that she get all of their materia, to which Yuffie laughs and assures Godo that she will. So when looking at what Biggs says later in Remake about Avalanche promising all of the materia in Midgar for Wutai's assistance, this becomes pretty convincing that Avalanche is not trying to appeal to Yuffie for her assistance, but rather Godo himself. For those who aren't aware of this, the obsession with materia that Godo and Yuffie share is actually quite important to understanding the mentality of these two characters, as the purpose for the materia is to use against Shinra. This explains a lot of Wutai's involvement in Intergrade when looking at Godo's reasoning for why he gave up trying to fight Shinra in the Wutai War in the original game. Strength without determination means nothing, and determination without strength is equally useless. So, as history describes it, the end of the Wutai War was pushed in favor of Shinra, and this was because of the appearance of Shinra's soldiers. And regardless of how much Godo wanted to keep fighting, his strength did not match that of the strength of Shinra, regardless of his determination. This is the key reason for Godo wanting to gather materia, as well as Yuffies, to balance the scale. While you may think that this mentality of these two characters is a self-contained event that only takes place in the original game, it is immediately brought up in the beginning of Yuffie's chapter in On the Way to a Smile, a book taking place after the events of Meteorfall. In the Forgotten Capital, Yuffie asks the party for the materia. After some debate, Cloud gives her only materia used for healing purposes. Godo, upon hearing that Yuffie has not brought back the powerful and more importantly dangerous materia, the materia that would be used to defend Wutai and fight Shinra, Godo is not upset. This is because both Yuffie and Godo come to the same conclusion. The only reason in which they would need to use that type of materia is to fight off Shinra, which, as we know at the time of On the Way to a Smile, Shinra is no longer a threat. The last thing I will mention is that the new Wutai government's Special Forces Group members are given the title of Shinobi, which is kind of a nice nod to Yuffie's theme song, Descendants of the Shinobi. Now that we have established Wutai's involvement with Avalanche, we're going to talk about another founder of Avalanche, one that we haven't discussed yet, but has the most presence in Remake than any other member of the original Avalanche, and has a direct tie to Wutai, and that is Rufus. In order to understand Rufus's involvement with Avalanche, we need to once again look at the time frame in which Avalanche is born. During the same month of Avalanche's inception, Rufus has already established himself somehow as one of the essential members, as his first mention of his involvement comes in formally in Before Crisis during the 6th month of the new year, as he is mentioned as Avalanche's informant. However, there is an earlier time in which Before Crisis establishes Rufus as being an ally to Avalanche, and that is during the 2nd month of the new year, again, the month after Avalanche's inception. This less obvious event comes literally the moment before the attempt on the president's life, during Avalanche's attempt to take over Junon, which, as I have stated earlier, is another event that is established as to have happened in Remake, giving this scene that much more importance. Right before the attempt on the president's life, Rufus calls his father, telling him that he has been watching his father through the Shinra security system, and that the situation isn't looking so hot for him. President Shinra is surprised by Rufus's call, as he mentions that the call is very out of character for his son to do. Rufus disregards the comment and then asks for more information on the new Turk, your playable character, to which he then just leaves. This is kind of important because President Shinra is right. This is extremely out of character for Rufus to do what he is doing, checking in on his father only to follow up to insinuate that his father might be killed. But what Rufus is doing here is actually more in character with the context of his involvement with Avalanche and what his specific talents are. It's worth noting that Rufus is kind of a tech guy. He often is able to gain access to Shinra information, get passcodes, and is able to slip by security systems that even the Turks have issues getting through. Some of this is most likely due to the access given to him through his position in Shinra, him being the vice president, but there are several instances that show him displaying this talent outside of the context of his title. One of the other things mentioned in the dialogue with Rufus is the surveillance system. Rufus spends a considerable amount of time using this system, as it gives him a view to pretty much all Shinra buildings, including reactors. Most likely the same system that we see being used by Mayor Domino, and the same system that Heidegger uses to monitor the reactor bombings. The reason Rufus uses these often is to gather information specifically for his use. Most of the intel he gathers is to accomplish the goal of killing his father. That is Rufus's prime motivation through the entirety of Before Crisis and in Remake, all in order to become the president, and he will do whatever is necessary to obtain that. The reason I mention this and this event is that this is most likely why Rufus is watching the scene unfold through the security system to begin with, and why he chooses this moment to call his father, as Rufus is not doing so to check up on his father, rather he is doing so for some sort of plan. There is no other motivator for him other than that to do so. He is most likely trying to get an update on the unfolding events for the purpose of giving information to Avalanche. This is also why he is asking specifically about the player Turk, as Avalanche's plan, in turn Rufus's plan, is being thwarted by your character. Again, this call happens literally as Fajito is trying to locate the president. So the level of coincidence, the motivation of Rufus's character, and his goal and involvement with Avalanche's actions make this rather convincing. The main takeaway here is that this establishes that Rufus is an integral part of Avalanche from the very beginning of its formation. And while Elf and Fajito are the face of Avalanche, a lot of what they end up doing is to further Rufus's agenda. His plan and the plan of Avalanche are one and the same. So, in Before Crisis, from the beginning, Rufus has been one of the key members of Avalanche. Now that we have the full context of Rufus's involvement with Avalanche and Wutai's involvement with Avalanche, I would like to make one more connection, as Rufus is also directly involved with Wutai. Rufus, Wutai, and Materia. As we know in Intermission, Avalanche HQ wants to strengthen its relationship with Wutai. In order to do so, Avalanche HQ offers them all of the materia in Midgar, to which Avalanche informs Wutai of an ultimate materia in Shinra HQ. From there, Yuffie is sent to Midgar to get it with the help of Avalanche HQ. These events directly mirror an event that has already taken place in the compilation in Crisis Core. Rufus in Crisis Core is noted as being a possible leak to Wutai for both soldier information and emails, but also is noted to gift Godo with information on the location of powerful materia, including summon materia like Bahamut Fury. This excerpt comes from Crisis Core's keyword section in its Ultimania. Blonde-haired man, a man who leaked the email addresses of soldier operatives and information regarding treasures to Godo, Yuffie's father, after the Wutai War. Both Lazard, who held a grudge against Shinra and knew the personal information of soldier operatives, and Rufus, who has close ties to the Avalanche base in Wutai, match this description. But the truth is unclear. While this information seems to be left intentionally obscure, pointing to either Lazard or Rufus, there are some very clear indicators pointing to Rufus being this leak. This becomes abundantly clear when we look into who exactly acquires and uses this information. The person who ends up using this information is Yuffie. After defeating the summoned Bahamut Fury in a side quest in Crisis Core, Yuffie tells Zack how she was able to locate the materia that she has been messaging Zack about. Right after the Wutai War was over, a blonde guy came to visit my dad. He brought all of these mail addresses and treasure scuttlebutt rumors with him. What is this event in Crisis Core a direct reflection of? This same event taking place between Godo and the blonde-haired man who is most likely Rufus is literally the same event that we are seeing with Wutai and Avalanche HQ. In Remake, Avalanche HQ isn't just giving the materia to Wutai, mind you. Avalanche HQ is simply pointing Wutai to the location of this mysterious materia. We have no idea where the rumor for this ultimate materia comes from, as there has yet to be any indication of how Avalanche HQ acquired this information to give to Wutai. This rumor of a powerful materia is the same type of rumor given to Godo by the blonde-haired man. In both instances, from Crisis Core and in Remake, Yuffie takes it upon herself to retrieve it. And in my opinion, in both instances of these events, Rufus is directly involved. I wholeheartedly think that Square is intentionally creating this duality of events in order to signify Rufus's involvement with Avalanche. Not only with Avalanche and Wutai in Crisis Core, but also to set up the context for Rufus's direct involvement with Avalanche HQ in both Remake and in Intergrade. Rufus is being set up to be the person behind all Avalanche's actions in Remake. This next segment will go over exactly how this relationship of Avalanche and Rufus has formed into Remake, as Rufus also has involvement with one other key event with Avalanche's history. The Death of Avalanche. Now we're going to move on to another important part of Avalanche's story. In the month right before Remake begins, the world premiere timeline states that the leader of Avalanche is killed. And that, my friends, is the moment in which Zirconiade is summoned in the final events of Before Crisis. This specific wording on the timeline here is a direct reference to Elf from Before Crisis, in which Elf is shot by Sung as directed to by Rufus. While she is supposedly murdered here, she is later discovered to have survived, and her death actually faked. By the way, when I say the exact wording is used in the timeline, I mean the exact wording used upon Elf's supposed death, and in the document that Rufus himself signs to confirm this at the end of Before Crisis. It is literally the same phrasing. This means that Elf in Remake is in fact alive, and still with her father Veld, whose death was also faked in the same shooting. This is proven to us because Veld is seen during the events of Meteorfall at the end of Before Crisis, and also has involvement in the events directly after Meteorfall in On the Way to a Smile, as he actually appears to give intel to the Turks in Calm. So while you may think that Elf and Veld are no longer active parties in Final Fantasy VII's universe, that is not the case. So why is Elf being alive so important? The reason it's important is because of who is responsible for them being alive in the first place. And that is because of Rufus, the finale of Before Crisis. Rufus, in a conversation with his father during the final moments of Before Crisis, talk about the Turks. As Before Crisis' story unravels, the president sees the Turks as more and more of a liability. It gets to the point where the president takes steps to eliminate the Turks. Rufus, being involved with the Turks up until this point, both having opposed them as well as having assisted them, cuts a deal with his father to prove their loyalty to Shinra as a company. The deal is made that the Turks can remain alive for the time being, but only if they carry out the duty of killing both Veld and Elf with their own hands, as Veld and Elf, while being helped by the Turks, have been primary targets of the company for quite some time. Rufus agrees to these terms set by his father, and he then tells Sung to carry out this task. Sung then, in a very over-the-top performance, fakes both of their deaths in front of both Reno, Rude, and several Shinra troops. Sung then makes sure to dispose of their bodies. Later on in the final scene, President Shinra holds a company meeting to decide the fate of the Turks, to which Rufus barges in, exclaiming the Turks' worth. He then uses the death of Veld and Elf as an example of the Turks' loyalty, which President Shinra agrees to continue allowing them to operate as a group under Shinra. After this meeting, Rufus and the remaining Turks in private go over the meeting, to which Rufus says, "That was quite the performance, Sung." Just to be absolutely clear with you guys, Sung didn't say a fucking thing during the meeting. What Rufus is referring to is how Sung made Elf and Veld's deaths believable enough so that Rufus could use their deaths as a bargaining chip to save the Turks' lives. Sung then thanks Rufus for all that he has done for the Turks, taking into account that Rufus just saved their former leader and mentor, but also saved their lives. Rufus then tells them that they essentially are indebted to him and only work for him, to which Rufus then signs a document knowing that Elf and Veld are alive to confirm that the leader of Avalanche was assassinated. Now, in one foul swoop, Rufus has taken control over the Turks and now is the only remaining leader of Avalanche, leaving absolutely no one to oppose his direction within a completely disjointed Avalanche, and is now the soon-to-be president of the most powerful corporation on the planet. He is now in control of Shinra, Avalanche, and now in Remake is directly tied to Wutai. This man literally has control over all of the major players of any conflict. And you can be sure as hell that we're going to go into how he is involved in Remake with Avalanche. Do you now see why the Zirconiade retcon was such a big deal? If it wasn't for this moment in Before Crisis, we wouldn't have any base to stand on to give any validity to any of this development. This concludes the established history provided by the World Preview timeline and the Before Crisis events, which fully establish Avalanche, Wutai, and the players within them. But from what we know of Remake, this is not the end of Avalanche. Now, we're going to establish right away how Avalanche as we know it from Before Crisis exists in the unfolding events in Remake. We're going to do this by looking at information provided by the recent Famitsu article on Intermission, as well as title cards within Remake that disclose finer details of Avalanche's function, to piece together what exactly has happened in the time frame between the death of Elf and the start of Remake. Remake defines Avalanche as an organization that has grown to such a large capacity that it as an entire entity has begun to split off into separate groups. These groups are created and distinguished by the growing differences in ideologies between the members of Avalanche. And while their different branches are differentiated by these ideologies, they still act towards the goal of destroying Shinra and work together in certain instances. We're going to talk about each of these groups, as some of these differing groups are directly featured in the story of both Remake and Intermission. Avalanche HQ, a group of planetologists working to protect the planet. As the organization grew, smaller cells began to splinter off. To distinguish themselves among the growing factions, it took the appellation HQ. Despite the many groups' different approaches and ideologies, they still occasionally work together for their one shared purpose, the destruction of Shinra. From what we know, this branch, Avalanche HQ, has existed for over a year since the events of Remake. This is because Barret's team mentions the fact that it had been an entire year since Barret's group split off from HQ, which means that before Avalanche HQ formed into its own separate branch, it was a part of the original Before Crisis Avalanche. As we know that HQ was formed a year before, in which Avalanche as it existed in Before Crisis was still unified. Something important moving forward is that you might hear other titles for Avalanche HQ like the main Avalanche branch, as the Japanese dialogue for Biggs clarifies that these two names are interchangeable in comparison with the English dialogue. This means that anyone associated with the main branch just know that they are talking about Avalanche HQ. With that cleared up, let's look at two main separations of ideologies when looking at the description for the main Avalanche branch. Main Avalanche branch. A powerful group called Avalanche that is against the actions of Shinra and raises awareness of the planet's life force. Barret's side of Avalanche uses violent ways to oppose Shinra, such as blowing up the Mako reactors, but the main Avalanche branch is different and wants to protect the lives of the citizens and free them from the grip that Shinra has on them. In order to build ties with the Wutai government, they assist them with the plans to steal the ultimate materia. This definition of Avalanche HQ allows us to clear up what the group of Avalanche's ideologies sit between. That of extreme and destructive actions taken by Barret's group, which endanger civilian lives through the bombing of the reactors, and Avalanche HQ's ideology to approach situations with more stealth and precise action, which these actions are far less damaging to innocent lives. These approaches create the dynamic in which the entire story of Avalanche unfolds in Remake. This also establishes why Barret and his branch was booted from Avalanche HQ to begin with. It is because of these growing differences between Barret's desire to take action, whereas HQ saw this approach as reckless. These ideologies are also very present in the compilation in Before Crisis, as these ideologies are completely represented in the characters Fajito and Elf. Were Elf's actions stem from wanting to create a world without Shinra's influence? She takes only the necessary steps to advance that goal, without trying to cause harm to innocent lives. Vegito, however, is an extremist and wants nothing more than all life to return to the planet in order to replenish the life stream. And because of this mindset, Vegito disregards the value of human life and seeks out any means necessary to further this goal, regardless of the repercussions that it might have on innocent lives. This is where these ideologies stem from, and this divide that we're seeing in Remake is most likely the direct result of this split ideology created in its now absent leaders. It's also important to note that there is a mention of another cell in Avalanche in Remake in Chapter 4 by Biggs, the Old Guard. This group is noted by Biggs in the Japanese dialogue as being either a conservative group or a part of the mainstream group, Avalanche HQ. It's important to mention them as this clarifies the earlier statement made through the quotes that while Avalanche as an entity is split up into separate branches now, these branches do work together to accomplish certain tasks. So just know that while it's unclear exactly who this group belongs to, Old Guard is actively working with Avalanche HQ by the time that Remake starts, and that any action taken by them is for the sake of Avalanche HQ's goals, which we will come to know is actually the plan of Rufus Shinra. It's also important to bring up that the Old Guard armor shown in Remake is a direct reference to Avalanche's design from Before Crisis, once again furthering the notion that what Avalanche represents in Before Crisis is being carried over directly into the events of Remake. There is another reference to Before Crisis Avalanche, but we will come to that a little bit later in the video. So with that, we clearly established the parties in which Avalanche as a whole is made up of in Remake. There is Avalanche HQ, which works with the Old Guard branch, and the one we are very clear on already, Barret's Avalanche. We will now be talking about Avalanche HQ, as most of its function within the story has been very obscure until now. From what we know of the recent announcements, Avalanche HQ consists of several new characters, but they are largely shrouded in mystery. As we know from Remake, Avalanche's story operates in the background, meaning that we never really understood in detail what the larger point of their involvement in Remake meant. We never really knew in detail where they operated from or know anything about the characters that make up this group. And knowing that Yuffie's story in Intermission only consists of 2 chapters, how is Intermission going to develop these Avalanche HQ characters to be functioning aspects of the story, rather than just have them be tacked on? What if I told you that the entire time Remake has been telling us their story, and you just didn't know it? And rather than them only being a part of several moments in Remake, they have actually been an integral part of the entire story, from literally start to end, and are the only reason in which all of the events in Remake take place the way that they do. That while Intermission is showing us these characters for the first time, Remake has already given us everything we need to know about who they are, where they operate from, and their importance to the story. Not only in terms of the events of Remake, but how they are important to the development of the main characters in Remake. This section will go over exactly how important these characters have been to the story so far, and how their story ties the loose ends of Remake's story all together. So, the questions are, who are they? Where do they operate from? And what is their impact on the story? While these questions seem to have straightforward answers, they have caused quite a bit of frustration already. Nayo, Polk, Juji, and Billy Bob are all new characters introduced in Intermission's trailer, all of them being given their own bios and names through the recent Famitsu article on Intergrade's DLC. There's quite a bit of trouble these characters have caused the larger theorizing community, as most of the community assumed before the Famitsu article came out that these were characters we already heard about in the base game of Remake, and that the characters Nayo, Polk, and Billy Bob were originally thought of as characters introduced in Barret's resolution, a scene that takes place later in Remake, in which Barret confides in Cloud. about the people on his mind that are keeping him up at night, to which he describes 3 Avalanche members: Nellie, the quartermaster of Barret's branch, and Jessie's close friend; Finn, a lazy kid who won't do anything unless it has to do with painting pictures, and for those who don't know, Finn is credited as the artist for painting the stamp graffiti all over Midgar; and Al, an intel guy mentioned to have ways of getting codes that Barret says he doesn't understand. He is also talked about as being a ladies' man, someone who used bouquets of flowers to try and woo them. Flowers that Barret assumes must have come from Aerith's garden. These people Barret regards as friends. These characters, as stated with Finn already had a presence in the base game of Remake. For example, their names are actually featured in the Dart minigame leaderboard in the 7th Heaven bar, meaning that these characters would frequent 7th Heaven. But with the recently released bios for the Avalanche HQ members in Intermission, giving us different names than what we assumed them to be, that was enough convincing evidence that Nellie, Al, and Finn were just not characters depicted in Intergrade's trailer, and because of that, they might not ever appear. To which I respond to that by saying, you are wrong. These characters in Avalanche HQ, Nayo, Polk, and Billy Bob are in fact the same ones mentioned by Barret in his resolution scene. And I am going to prove this to you right now. And to do so, we're going to take a look at each character's description, both the descriptions given in the recent Famitsu article and the descriptions given in Barret's resolution scene. Then we are going to compare them to each other, in which I plan to prove to all of you that these characters are in fact the same in every way. The first one being the one that is the most blatant. Nellie is Nayo. Nellie's job in Avalanche HQ, the branch that Barret claims that she was a part of, was a quartermaster. Her job, by definition, is to distribute goods and oversee branches. Nayo's job is disclosed as being the overseer of the branch for Avalanche HQ, to which she watches Barret's branch intently. Finn is Polk. Finn is a lazy good-for-nothing. Polk is a lazy good-for-nothing, spending his time playing the board game Fort Condor. Finn is said by Barret to be a kid. Guess what? Polk is also a kid, and is also stated in his bio to be the youngest branch member in Avalanche HQ, to which he is teased and mocked, but he is also treated as a younger brother. This is important to note that the way Barret talks about the entirety of these characters in the resolution scene is with this same type of bond. Jessie and Nellie being described as sisters, Barret expressing how good of an artist Finn is by telling Cloud he drew every stamp. This is the same type of relationship reflected in Polk's bio. Polk isn't disclosed as having any formal role in Avalanche HQ, neither does Finn. The only thing that we know for certain is that Finn is an artist. Al is Billy Bob. Al is an intel guy. Billy Bob is an intel guy. What a fucking coincidence. Barret says that Al has ways of getting codes that he doesn't understand. Billy Bob appears to be lazy on the surface, having not used any of his senior experience in Avalanche to its fullest extent, but manages to use his talent for drinking alcohol to secretly gather intel from bars. This is the secret way of how Al gets his information, the way that Barret doesn't understand. Barret only perceives Al, who is Billy Bob's, behavior as having a good time, without knowing that he is actually working. This is simply describing how Al gets this kind of unobtainable information. They are the same. The two groups of the 3 characters mentioned all fulfill the same role as one another perfectly. Not only that, but they belong to the same branch of Avalanche, Avalanche HQ. One of these groups, for no reason, seems to have vanished completely. They didn't just disappear, they are the same people. Now, you're saying to yourself, right, now, sure, each character has the same function as the other. Literally the same. That's pretty convincing, but you have yet to answer the most glaring question. Why are their names different? Because the Famitsu article gave us the answer. The key comes from one quote from the other character introduced in Intermission, Juje. His quote in his bio discloses one major piece of information: code names. You refers to you guys. It's like a secret word, a secret name for each member of Avalanche. Nayo, Polk, and Billy Bob are code names for Nellie, Finn, and Al. So with that, we can definitively say that these characters are the same. Now, I want to establish that now that we understand the context of these characters, we need to look at where their base is located, as it gives us a couple of insights as to how and why certain characters might have shown up at the end of Remake, something that will play directly into the events covered in Dirge of Cerberus. Sector 5. Just a heads up, from this point forward in the video, I will be using the names Nellie, Al, and Finn to describe those characters in order to eliminate any confusion. So just know that when I say those names, that I am also referring to the same characters mentioned in Intermission's bio. So while you may think that Avalanche HQ is operating from Sector 7, that is not the case. All they are doing is hiding there. We know that Avalanche HQ is hiding in Sector 7 because Square deliberately illustrates this point in each one of Avalanche HQ members' bios. Nellie, hiding within the Sector 7 slums. Al, members who are hidden away in the Sector 7 slums. Finn, Avalanche branch in hiding. So, if Avalanche HQ is hiding in Sector 7, then where does Avalanche HQ operate from usually? The answer to that question is Sector 5. This information is provided to us through Barret in Chapter 5 when Barret talks about Finn. We already confirmed that Finn is the artist from Avalanche HQ that created the stamp graffiti throughout Remake. The use of this graffiti, however, is to secretly communicate to other Avalanche members. In Chapter 5, it leads Cloud and the party out of the train tunnels. Barret tells Cloud that the graffiti was made by their friends in Sector 5. Well, there you go. This most likely is suggesting that the friends that Barret is referring to is not just Finn, but also Nellie and Al. Avalanche HQ. This allows us to answer some unexpected questions. Sector 5, for those who don't know, is the same place in which Aerith lives, and it is also the same place where the orphanage is located. These two places also softly hint that Sector 5 is the original place for Avalanche HQ. Biggs worked at the orphanage in Sector 5 and seemingly left without reason. We know that Biggs cared about this place deeply, so why would he have left at all? This wasn't because he didn't need work, as we know that Biggs still works. This is indicated at the beginning of Chapter 4, when Biggs looks at a poster looking for people to enlist in the Shinra army. Biggs mentions that they most likely get paid more than he does. This indicates that Biggs is still working. So if he is, why not in Sector 5? There's no specified date mentioned for his departure, but the coincidence of his departure falling somewhere in between the time of Barret disbanding from Avalanche HQ to the current events in Remake make this very odd. Whatever was so important to cause Biggs to say goodbye to the orphanage that he cares about so deeply, a place that he asks Cloud in his final moments in Remake to keep an eye on if he doesn't survive. This might have been because Biggs left Avalanche HQ with Barret to Sector 7, leaving behind his old job that he cares about deeply. This is also mentioned with Al, as Al gets bouquets of flowers to hit on the ladies. Barret mentions that these flowers most likely come from Aerith's garden being in Sector 5. This would further elaborate on the location in which Al and the rest of the party might have been. So, other than the mention of Finn by Barret, there are two members of Avalanche HQ having an association with the same area, Sector 5, again further suggesting that these locations are not just coincidence. There is one more indication of this at the end of Remake, and also clears up a lot of mystery surrounding this scene. At the end of the game, Biggs is lying in a bed on the second floor of the orphanage. Beside him are flowers, most likely from Aerith's garden, and Jessie's gloves. Who brought him to Sector 5 specifically? The most likely thing that would have happened during the events of Platefall is someone from Avalanche HQ got Biggs and brought him back to Sector 5, perhaps somewhere close enough to HQ's base in order to keep an eye on him and nurse him back to health. Why do I believe this? Well, looking simply at the evidence, whoever did bring Biggs here had a working knowledge of Biggs's relationship with Jessie, a working knowledge of his time at the orphanage, but above anything else, they would have had a working knowledge of Biggs's involvement with Avalanche HQ in general, as nobody tells Barret, who is in Sector 5 after Platefall, that Biggs is in the orphanage. This would mean that Biggs's survival was meant to be a secret from everyone. The only ones in particular who would have this knowledge to be so careful at this point in the story is Avalanche HQ. Know that there isn't any other part of Barret's branch that could have put Biggs here. It couldn't have been Jessie, even if she was alive, which she isn't, because by the time Platefall is occurring, both Jessie and Biggs are unconscious. Wedge, at this moment in time, is also accounted for, and is also unconscious in Deepground, meaning that the only other person with a working knowledge of Biggs's relationship with Jessie and Avalanche HQ, and would have brought him to this location, was another Avalanche HQ member. Now, I wanted to mention this scene in particular, not only for what I just mentioned, but because I do think that this scene of Biggs' awakening will come back into play in a very serious way in Intermission. As we have talked about already, Intermission has been layering certain scenes and events from the compilation on top of events that we see directly transpiring in Remake, like Yuffie and the Materia with Rufus. While this discussion has only gone over the events that directly pertain to Before Crisis so far, keep in mind moving forward that this type of integration is much broader than just the one game from the compilation. So, in conclusion, this all provides substantial evidence that Nellie, Al, and Finn are the members of Avalanche HQ in Intermission. Their base is in Sector 5 and are hiding out in Sector 7, where they have aliases. But there is one more member of Avalanche HQ that I would like to bring up. Sonon. Sonon is mentioned to be from Wutai, but he is not mentioned to be formally a part of the Special Forces team that Yuffie is involved in. Sonon also doesn't seem to have arrived in Midgar with Yuffie either. While Sonon's bio might lead you to believe that he is, this information is intentionally obscure. This information only states that Sonon is a part of Yuffie's infiltration of Midgar and Shinra HQ. The assignment is not specified as being given to him from Wutai. So what is going on? There are a couple bits of information that tell you who Sonon is working for. While you may think that he is introducing himself to Nellie, if you look at where he's standing, he is actually facing Yuffie when he says this. Not only that, but Nellie welcomes Sonon back, meaning that the two are already acquainted. The other indicator of this is that Sonon knows his way around Sector 7 already. In Juji's bio, he is said to be tasked with showing Yuffie around Sector 7. Sonon is purposefully excluded from this. That is because Sonon is already familiar with Sector 7. So the question you might have is, if Sonon isn't actually operating with Yuffie from Wutai, then who does he actually work for? He is working with Avalanche HQ directly. The question is why? Why is Sonon not involved with Wutai. Sonon, in every way, is a perfect candidate for the Special Operatives program that Yuffie is a part of for quite a few reasons, as Sonon has trained under Godo himself. Not only that, but Sonon is said to have joined the Wutai army at a young age, meaning that if anything, Sonon would be the perfect candidate for this special program and would be an asset to Wutai. So why isn't he? Why isn't he working from Wutai? This indicates that somewhere between the events of the Wutai War, which we know Sonon was a part of, and the Wutai War's end, Sonon became uninvolved with Wutai, and in my opinion, he defected. Sonon's expertise and his association with the army points to a very specific group that is introduced in the compilation, one that fits Sonon's desertion perfectly, as this group was created by Wutai warriors like himself, the Crescent Unit and the Wutai Remnants. The Wutai Remnants are a small group of Wutai army soldiers who banded together to confront Shinra after the Wutai War. But while this group is made up of soldiers from the Wutai army, there is no indication that what they are doing is in association with Wutai directly, as the emails in Crisis Core that are sent to Zack specifically that they are a detached Wutai army. Note that these groups also have separate branches, very much like Avalanche, meaning that they are most likely all rogue groups of Wutai soldiers, meaning that where Wutai may have given up on fighting Shinra, the army did not. And in order to restore Wutai to its former glory, they continue to operate to destroy Shinra. This is further insinuated by just how defeated Godo is by the time the ceasefire is instated. And rather than trying to restore Wutai's honor, Godo just gives up. Godo's inaction is the same catalyst for Yuffie's efforts to restore Wutai honor, which I can only imagine is the same drive that the Wutai Remnants would have as well. But that's not all the Wutai Remnants are driven by, as there is one thing that clearly separates their motivation: revenge. The Wutai Remnants not only fight Shinra, but aim to claim their revenge on Soldier, specifically Zack Fair, who was involved in the defeat of Wutai at the end of the Wutai War. The drive for revenge that the Wutai Remnants have, a group of Wutai soldiers who fought in the Wutai War, who seemingly have no tie with Wutai, all of these motivations are directly reflected in Sonon. Where Yuffie's drive is to restore honor to Wutai, Sonon's drive is to get revenge, most likely for his sister, which is noted in Intergrade's trailer. So whether Sonon has an association directly or not, these differing motivations seem to be very present in Yuffie and Sonon's relationship, and it is very clear from the trailer that they do not really see eye to eye. And I have a feeling that this will most likely be the catalyst for some sort of conflict between the two characters, as their ideologies, much like the dynamic set with Avalanche HQ and Barret, clearly separates them. So, now that we know all of the parties and the characters and their backgrounds in regards to Avalanche, Wutai, and Shinra, we need to start looking at the story of Remake and Intermission. How does all of this information translate directly into Remake's story? All of this is done so perfectly. We will be going over the events of Chapter 1, Chapter 4, and go into the final Shinra HQ event. So while you may think to yourself that all of this is familiar territory to you, know that there is an underlying new story being told in every single one of the events we go over. Before Remake, a year before the events of Remake began, Barret, who was a Midgar Avalanche lead, was booted from Avalanche HQ. This meant that Barret no longer would be able to have any formal contact between Avalanche HQ and his group. Their actions, including all of their activities and information, would be withheld from being disclosed to him. Just to be clear, that goes for Avalanche as a bigger entity, but also the other branches and their separate activities. Simply put, Barret was fired. When Barret gets the boot, Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge, having worked under Barret and believing in what he stood for, left Avalanche HQ as well. It's around this time that they all form Barret's unofficial Avalanche group. Sometime later, prior to the first bombing mission at the start of Remake, a warehouse in Sector 7 is looted for gunpowder. You heard me correctly, the same warehouse that you loot later in the game is looted prior to Barret's party's first bombing run. This gunpowder, which was looted from that warehouse, is then acquired by Jessie, as the gunpowder is the same ingredient that Jessie uses to create the bombs in the first bombing mission. Know that at this point in the story, Jessie isn't acquiring this gunpowder herself. She is going through an unnamed supplier. It's extremely important to keep in mind that at this point in the story, Barret's group of Avalanche has not done anything substantial and has been completely off the radar up until the first bombing mission. They haven't blown up any reactors or raised any suspicion. And because of that, while they aren't officially a part of Avalanche HQ anymore, their connection to the headquarters seems to be on good enough terms at this particular time to still gain some benefits from their original branch. Not long after this, Tifa proposes that Barret hire her old friend. The bombing run. Barret's Avalanche begins their infiltration. Jessie, while using passcodes to get the Reactor 1 doors open, discloses to Cloud that she was able to get these passcodes from her former branch member, and that it's a shame that no one else at HQ will talk to them, to which she cites the disagreement between Avalanche HQ and Barret's party. This is important as this is the second instance where Avalanche HQ members, specifically Nellie, Al, and Finn, are brought up and are actively affecting the story. This time it's Al, who we know is able to acquire passcodes for Avalanche HQ. Barret's Avalanche most likely reached out to get passcodes that would allow them to access the reactor. I know I said that this is the second instance of Avalanche HQ helping. That will also come back into play later. This also communicates that while there is a disconnect between Barret's branch and the other Avalanche branches, and with Avalanche HQ, they still have some communication established at this time in the story. So the Reactor 1 mission is successful, and Cloud gets a lesson on Midgar from Jessie. In the Japanese dialogue, Jessie makes it clear that she is the one creating the fake IDs, to which she explains their importance. The IDs hold all information about an individual that Shinra needs to know, the most important being their level of access. Jessie's IDs are only suitable for basic clearance in Midgar. This allows them to take trains just like any normal citizen. This also goes for Nellie's fake IDs as well. Yes, Nellie creates fake IDs for Avalanche HQ, just like Jessie. Keep this in mind for later. But keep in mind that both of these teams' fake IDs do not have special perks. Moving right on to Chapter 3. Shinra begins investigating gunpowder stolen from the warehouse incident prior to the first bombing run. This investigation leads the Shinra officers to Johnny, not because he is implicated in any Avalanche activity, as we know from his bio that he isn't a part of Avalanche, but more so because he can't keep his mouth shut, and there is a chance that Johnny can point the Shinra troops in the direction of Avalanche. The Shinra troops get Johnny to give them Jessie's name, with no context. The Shinra troops do this by telling Johnny that his name came up in the warehouse records. They then indicate that this was a ploy to get Johnny to spill the beans, and that even if his ID was used to try and get into the warehouse, he doesn't have enough clearance to get in. This again echoes what we have talked about with the IDs so far, and also tell us, the audience, that Johnny isn't the supplier for Jessie for the gunpowder. He's just an idiot. Somewhere around the same time, Jessie tries to get into contact with her supplier for more gunpowder, and is denied. This is confirmed by the fact that Jessie tries to hire Cloud before the group's celebration for their next mission. This means that at this point in the story, Jessie has already formulated her own plan to get into the warehouse to get the gunpowder she needs for the bombs for the next mission. During the group's pre-celebration for the next mission, Barret's group reflects on the road that led them to this moment. This is what comes up. Barret's group was kicked out. Jessie is still mad about the separation. Everyone else is chummy about it, but Jessie doesn't want to talk about it. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering to yourself, how does everything we talked about give context for Intergrade? This all comes to a head in Chapter 4. Jessie hires Cloud to take her to Sector 7's topside and break into her father's room to get his keycard. His ID giving Jessie the clearance to access the warehouse. The same warehouse that was mentioned earlier in the game. The same one that Jessie's supplier got the gunpowder from. Biggs and Wedge join them with their new fake IDs and some bikes. But because of their level of clearance, the group alerts security on their way up to the warehouse. Not because their IDs don't scan properly, but because of the time of night and the level of access they have. After that, Cloud successfully gets Jessie's father's keycard, and Jessie begins sneaking into the warehouse from the back, while Cloud with Biggs and Wedge goes in through the front to take attention away from Jessie looting in the warehouse. This is because even though she has the card, there's still a potential for Jessie to be caught by Shinra troops. Upon starting the mission, Cloud, Biggs, and Wedge notice that someone else has already knocked out the Shinra guards. This happens before Jessie alerts the party to her entering the facility. This is clarified later that the guards being knocked out was Avalanche HQ's doing. The gate that seemingly guards the warehouse is opened, and guards are patrolling the front. They then indicate that they were sent on patrol to find some form of intruder, but have not spotted any. This indicates to us that there is some sort of infiltration already happening, but the infiltration has gone mostly unnoticed until the guards spot Cloud, to which Shinra overwhelms the party, harming Wedge. Old guard, who has sided with Avalanche HQ, suddenly appears out of nowhere, mind you, and begins pushing back against the Shinra security, and picks Wedge up. Biggs leads Cloud away from the conflict unfolding with Avalanche HQ, and they retreat. Biggs mentions that Avalanche struck a deal with Wutai with the intent of taking all of the materia in Midgard. Then the gate closes. Shinra then pulls up to block all entrances and exits. Then Cloud and Biggs meet up with Jessie, and Wedge is dropped off from a passing truck. The indication there being that Avalanche is in the Shinra truck and make their escape. So, as you can see, there is a lot to talk about. Let's start off by saying all of these events are being used to tell a larger story. But where do we start? Let's start off at the beginning. If the warehouse that Jessie is looting is the same warehouse that is mentioned as being looted before Remake began, and this warehouse still has the gunpowder that Jessie needs to create more bombs for the next mission, then why would Jessie's supplier ignore her? It's not because the warehouse's lack of supplies, as Jessie is successful in retrieving the gunpowder. So what changed between then and now in regards to Jessie and her supplier? The answer to why the supplier does not respond to her would be due to the events of Mako Reactor 1. At this point in the story, Barret's group has drawn a considerable amount of attention to themselves. Don Corneo's men begin investigating the slums in search of Barret's location. We learn from Don Corneo himself later that this search was demanded by Heidegger for President Shinra. This was done in order to confirm the location of Barret's Avalanche, and after finding them, Shinra plans to drop the plate to eliminate them. Now, it's very important to note that after Mako Reactor 1's explosion, there is no other contact that Barret's Avalanche group has with Avalanche HQ. There are no more codes shared, no information or supplies given. Nothing that Barret and the rest of the party do have anything to do with Avalanche HQ. This means that at the point in which Jessie's mission starts, Avalanche HQ is no longer providing the support to Barret's group the way they had before. Now, the other strange coincidence is that Avalanche HQ shows up to the warehouse before Jessie and Cloud did. Now, Jessie was only able to gain access to the warehouse because of her father's ID. This was because it had high-level clearance. Avalanche HQ was, and is currently, able to get into the warehouse with the same level of clearance or higher. This not only allowed Avalanche HQ to move through the warehouse without revealing their identities through the prior mentioned ID log, and do so without a distraction. As we know from the warehouse gate being opened, Avalanche HQ came in through the front of the warehouse. meaning that they were able to move through the warehouse freely in plain sight. We know that the soldiers' reaction to finding Cloud, that Avalanche HQ was able to move through the warehouse without being detected by Shinra soldiers or raise any alarm. The only time that Avalanche HQ reveals itself is when an armed group of old guards shows up after the warehouse has already been put on high alert. The point I am trying to make here is that Avalanche HQ would have, without raising any suspicion, would have been able to go into the warehouse and out of it without ever having been detected. As we know from the prior warehouse heist, it seems as though the warehouse theft wasn't really accounted for, which caused Shinra to go looking for any type of security breach, that the logs indicated nothing strange, which is why the Shinra troops went to Johnny in the first place, which indicates that the only reason Old Guard showed up the way they did, guns blazing, is because Jessie and Cloud alerted the warehouse and messed up Avalanche HQ's plan. And now that the warehouse was on high alert, the people inside needed a different escape route, one that we know Avalanche HQ has in place in the form of a Shinra truck. This indicates to me that the only party equipped enough to have retrieved the gunpowder to begin with for Jessie at the beginning of Remake was Avalanche HQ. They are the only ones with enough clearance, equipment, and knowledge to do so, meaning whoever Jessie's supplier was someone in Avalanche. Someone who Jessie had an open line of communication with. And as we know from the first bombing mission, the only connection she had to Avalanche was with her former branch at Avalanche HQ. And it just so happens that there is one character in Avalanche HQ who is the designated supplier of other branches of Avalanche. A character who has a close relationship with Jessie. And that is Nellie. Nellie is the only person in the entire game that meets every bit of criteria to be the prime suspect for Jessie's supplier. Now, I want to say that if I am right, which I do believe I am right, that if Jessie's supplier is in fact Nellie, this creates way more character development, not only for Jessie, but especially for Nellie, and we haven't even met her yet. Nellie and Jessie. There's a lot of context to see that Jessie and Nellie's relationship has been a little rocky since Barret's division was formed. This is given some context when we look back on Barret's Avalanche, reflecting on their journey so far before the second bombing mission, where the group has seemingly moved on from the split with Avalanche HQ. Jessie has clearly not. Jessie is upset because the split not only divided the branch, but it divided Jessie and Nellie's relationship. At the end of the day, they both made their choices to stay with one side or the other. And keep in mind that the characterization for Jessie in Remake paints her involvement in Avalanche as extremely personal, meaning that the goal for Jessie isn't just to save the planet, it is to save her father. Now you would think that anything stopping her from reaching that goal is going to rub her the wrong way. So what was the disagreement? What caused Nellie to deny Jessie the gunpowder? Barret's branch destroyed their first reactor, to which it goes horribly over the line and causes enough damage to endanger the lives of the people in Sector 1. At this moment in time, this solidifies the differences between the two parties, and there is no turning back. This is where Nellie, as well as Avalanche HQ as a whole, draws the line. Because of their decision to assist Jessie in a seemingly harmless way, has now gone against all of what Avalanche HQ stands for. So the decision is made to no longer enable Jessie and the rest of Barret's Avalanche. Hence the reason Jessie is unable to get in touch with Nellie for supplies. This is why, in the trailer, Nellie is hesitating to approach Barret and Tifa. It's because there are a lot of conflicting feelings. While there is the desire in Nellie to approach Barret's group, as they are her friends, and there is a want for her to warn them about the imminent platefall, which Avalanche HQ does know about, she cannot. Being the overseer of her branch, Nellie sees the actions of Barret's branch as not only a liability to Avalanche HQ's safety, but also to Avalanche HQ's mission. And ultimately, yes, this is Shinra's fault, but neither Barret or Jessie know that. So at the end of the day, all of these actions fall directly onto Barret's decisions. Because what is the direct result of Barret's cavalier behavior? Barret reveals Avalanche in the first bombing mission, causing Shinra to start searching for Avalanche. Don Corneo's men locate Barret in Sector 7, which leads Heidegger and the President not only to use his actions to fuel the propaganda to wage war with Wutai, it also leads them to the decision to drop the Sector 7 plate to end Barret's avalanche, which leads to not only Jessie's death, but the many innocent lives in Sector 7. So what is this all for? Not only does this give Nellie and the rest of Avalanche HQ a mountain of character development to easily explore in intermission, but it is also to expand on Barret's character, because the weight of all of these events and the repercussions of Barret's actions are directly reflected in Barret's resolution scene. What keeps Barret up at night is thinking about Nellie, Al, and Finn. He is thinking about them because Barret doesn't know if they are alive at this point in the story or not, because he knows that he put their lives in danger the same way he put his own branch at risk. He is sleepless because he is wrestling with the thought that maybe all of these deaths and all of these events and the death of his friends are all because of what he's done. What is this internal struggle a direct reflection of for Barret? Well, this is a one-for-one of the same character development that Barret gets in Corel, and this same feeling of responsibility for his actions is the same dynamic that Dine creates for Barret as a character later on in the original game. Ultimately, Barret isn't responsible for this, and he will ultimately need to address that. All that Remake has set up for him is to confront that in a bigger way than he did in the original. To conclude this thought, this is what Remake is masterful at. All of what it is working towards is for the purpose of setting up a layered context, not only to expand on the lore into the original game, but also gives us interesting character dynamics and conflict. This same concept will directly parallel the next character we are going to talk about. Now, while you think we're done, we're not, which might have you screaming, but this is what happens when you need the full scope of information, because we skipped over the most obvious reason for Chapter 4 to begin with. How did Avalanche manage to get into the warehouse twice without being detected? Shinra HQ introduction. Avalanche HQ had ID clearance that is clearly above the ability of any fake ID card produced by Nellie or Jessie. One that is not only high clearance, but doesn't flag suspicion in the system to implicate anyone in Avalanche HQ. Avalanche HQ also had the ability to move around the warehouse without being detected, not only inside of the warehouse, but also on the way out of the warehouse. Avalanche HQ being able to get past a Shinra troop security checkpoint right outside of the warehouse without being immediately identified as Avalanche. An escape route with a Shinra security truck with IDs that would not be flagged by any highway security system, like Jessie and Cloud's did during Avalanche HQ's escape. Do you see what this would all require? An ID with high-level access to the doors, as well as enough clearance to ensure that the security checkpoints on the highway are not triggering any suspicion, and a disguise for not only the interior of the warehouse, but also for the security checkpoint on the way out, as well as a Shinra truck. If you don't see what's going on now, you will in a second. Here is the easier question. Why does Avalanche HQ want the gunpowder? We know that Avalanche HQ is a non-lethal group, so if they are not planning on blowing up reactors, then what are they attempting to accomplish? This is where we get to Intergrade, Shinra HQ. In Avalanche HQ's Sector 7 location, we see a whiteboard with 3 defining blueprints from Shinra HQ. One is the Shinra HQ lobby, one is the library in which Mayor Domino is located, one is the food court in which the Avalanche supporter awaits to give the party further access to the upper floors. 2 helicopters are also featured on this board, which should also be triggering that part of your brain that asks you how they got such detailed information on Shinra HQ, as well as how Avalanche HQ gets these helicopters, which, by the way, when these do show up, they are specifically Shinra helicopters. Everything depicted on the whiteboard are the necessary locations in order to get access to the floors that we needed to get to President Shinra's office. This plan seemingly has been the primary focus of Avalanche HQ, this attack on Shinra HQ. So everything that they have been doing up until this point has been in an effort to focus their efforts on a single attack, rather than endangering the lives of people through the destruction of reactors. The plan is as stated by Wedge at a later part of the game to flush out the president. Keep this in mind here, their goal is not to kill the president, but to get him out in the open. Why? Because this is not Avalanche HQ's plan. That is because from the fucking beginning, this plan was created and put into motion by none other than the real leader of Avalanche, Rufus Shinra. The goal to kill his father and assume control as the president of Shinra Electric Power Company. The entire point of his mission in Before Crisis, his entire reasoning for faking Avalanche's defeat, all being realized, all of his actions from the beginning advance him towards this moment. But as we know from the events of Remake, this does not go off without some issues. And that is because this plan is once again hijacked by Cloud and his party. Seriously, every step of the way, Barret's team is making this difficult. So now we are going to quickly go through the events that take place here. As we can see, upon the arrival of Cloud's party, Shinra has already received word that there is some sort of plan in motion to attack the Shinra building. This will be important when we discuss Yuffie's mission. As we know from the timing of events, Cloud's group arrives first, beating Avalanche to the punch, at least to the upper floors of Shinra HQ. The reason we know this is because upon meeting Domino, that this meeting was anticipated by Mayor Domino. But Mayor Domino learns later in that conversation that they are not here to give Shinra his comeuppance, as Cloud's party's plan was not the one Mayor Domino was informed of, to which he suspects that Barret's branch wasn't informed. We do know, however, after the drum, Cloud passes out and wakes up. Biggs has already arrived with Mayor Domino. This means that at this moment in time, while Cloud and party did beat Avalanche HQ up to the upper floors, Avalanche HQ has caught up, and then the bombs go off. Let me say that again. The bombs go off. Avalanche HQ's goal in Chapter 4 was to get the gunpowder from the warehouse to build bombs for this moment. Now, this is extremely important. In between the moment of Cloud passing out and him awakening, there is a random scene with the Turks, where they are called by Rufus to retrieve him. As we know, Rufus arrived in Midgar sometime after Platefall, meaning that Rufus is in an undisclosed location in Midgar already. The timing of Avalanche HQ's plan and the call with Rufus perfectly coincides with the following events. Cloud's party is told by Wedge that he asked Avalanche HQ to help him get Cloud's party out of Shinra HQ. This might seem obvious, but this is very important to note. is that this means that Nellie, Al, and Finn are most likely alive, and this once again clarifies that they were able to get out of Sector 7 before Platefall. Not only that, but Wedge was able to locate them, which we know where Wedge was by the time that Cloud's group set out to infiltrate Shinra, and that he is in Sector 5. It's like, how much more convincing do I have to be? Also note that because of Avalanche putting its plan into motion officially, the building is put on lockdown, removing access to every door in Shinra HQ, except for the drum. Remember this elevator. Cloud is instructed to move through the drum and to the helipad outside of President Shinra's office, to which Cloud arrives, and the president has been thrown out of some glass and now hangs on the helipad railing. President Shinra is then killed after fighting Genova. A Shinra helicopter with Avalanche's A painted on the side of it, being piloted by 2 members of Old Guard, appear. The Old Guard pilot reports back directly to Avalanche HQ, stating that it is making another run to search for friendlies, indicating that this helicopter has already done this before. Rufus shoots down the helicopter and then arrives. At the end of this fight with Cloud, Rufus remarks that this is a new era for Shinra. Do you see it now? Each moment in succession, the call from Rufus, the execution of Avalanche HQ's plan, the president's situation, his death, the arrival of Rufus Shinra, and his claim of a new era beginning. Rufus Shinra, from before Crisis all the way up until this moment in Remake, has been in charge of Avalanche the entire time. This entire time, he was in power, and it was right under everyone's nose. From Elf's death to his assistants in the warehouse to Shinra HQ, this has been Rufus's plan to finally succeed in killing his father. Realized. Every step methodically calculated and then executed. This is the full scope of Rufus. The full scope of who he is as a character, as introduced in the compilation. All that he is capable of is being delivered to us in Remake. And now he has every single element of the world's powers, Avalanche, Wutai, and Shinra, all threads that connect to this one man's actions. This provides us in every single way, shape, or form the entire story of Avalanche, both past and present, Wutai's established connection to Avalanche and Rufus, and how Remake has given us everything that the compilation has to offer, and done so to expand and deepen all of its characters, Barret's conflict, Rufus's masterful planning, and the deeper character development of characters we haven't even met yet. This is the full power of Final Fantasy VII, all for the point of fantastic storytelling. And you want to know what the best fucking part is? This isn't the only thing that Remake is giving its complete self to. As we know, Dirge of Cerberus in its full force in Remake's story, with the reveal of Vice, a thread which not only gives us everything we need to know about Dirge of Cerberus's inclusion into Remake, but sets the stage for a character that we have been talking about for so.
Commissioner, a rogue transmission is being broadcast on all wavelengths.
At last. The time has come.
Now, let the hunt begin.
Deepground. I never thought Square would just do this so blatantly. Before Crisis and Dirge of Cerberus are both being used to their fullest extent. Deepground's inclusion in the game in such a large way, including the reveal of Vice, including the reveal of Deepground soldiers, indicates a lot of direction that we have previously talked about on this channel. It also hints at a larger character's involvement in the story going forward. Genesis. Now, we know that Dirge of Cerberus takes place after the events of Advent Children, And while that time does hold some very major significance to what we see in Intermission, we're going to be looking at a widely mysterious part of Dirge of Cerberus that actually takes place during the events of the original game, and that is Dirge of Cerberus's multiplayer story. This story was meant to act as a prequel of events to what takes place during DOC's main story. This prequel story features the inner workings of Deepground and all of the antagonists of Dirge of Cerberus's main story. The events disclose the background of many of those characters and explain how they come to be a real threat 3 years after the original events of Final Fantasy VII. And from those findings, we're going to determine what we can expect to see in Intermission. What are the events that we know have happened in Deepground at the time of OG? Who can we expect to see because of this? And what does this location in Yuffie's chapter in Deepground mean for where we can expect Yuffie's story to end up? And where does that take us in regards to Remake's bigger picture? So in order to understand the events of the multiplayer, you need to understand what exactly is going on between the Deepground soldiers, who are all a part of a secret rebellion, and the powers that are put into place by Shinra. The Deepground soldiers who comprise the rebellion are Weiss, the leader of the Deepground Rebellion, and he is also known as the Emperor, and the Colored Sviets. Colored Sviets are the most powerful experiments in all of Deepground. This is because these experiments were given Genesis's genes that are a direct result of Genesis's birth, enhancing them beyond that of normal Deepground experiments. So just know here that right off the bat, this further gives legitimacy to Genesis's involvement in Remake's story, simply by the fact that Weiss is even in Remake. If you think you know where this is all going, there is way more to that than meets the eye. Trust me, but we're going to get to that a bit later. The Colored Sviets are made up of Weiss the Immaculate, his brother Nero the Sable, Rosso the Crimson, Azul the Cerulean, Shelk the Transparent, and Argento. Then there is the entirety of the regular Sviets, the elite soldiers of Deepground, and then regular Deepground soldiers. The above mentioned are so Mako dependent that their only way in which they can survive is through the suits that they wear, and Mako baths, the same suits that we see in Intermission. This group and the Colored Sviets are all essentially prisoners in Deepground, held against their will to be a part of the experiments of Deepground scientists. All of these prisoners are dedicated to Weiss, as he is the strongest amongst the Deepground soldiers and is the heart of the rebellion. All of these groups together make up this secret rebellion. Now, the ones appointed to watch over Deepground and all of its experimentation for Shinra are soldiers who are in control of Deepground, the Restrictors. Characters that have had the entirety of their identities removed from any official records, all in an effort by Shinra to keep the experiments of Deepground a complete secret. Deepground is a place for human experimentation, and the goal of these experiments is to create the most powerful soldiers for President Shinra's use. These experiments are those born in Deepground, created in Deepground, or people who have volunteered willingly to participate in these experiments, or are captured individuals that once lived on the surface of Gaia. The point is that all Deepground soldiers are essentially kept in Deepground against their will, and regardless of how they feel about their situation, they must fight each other in order to stay alive. The reason for this forced conflict is not only to test the experiments and make them stronger, it is also done to collect battle data that is then gathered and used for further experimentation on both existing members and to create new specimens. This process is repeated over and over and over and over until they get the absolute best result. the strongest soldier possible. So Vice, the strongest colored Sviet in Deepground, decides one day that he no longer wishes to be a slave to Deepground. So he, along with the other colored Sviets, decide that they wish to break free from Shinra's control and take over Deepground. But as you're about to find out, this is a lot more difficult than it sounds, and this is for a couple of reasons. The first one being a program known as Lady Patricia. Lady Patricia is the program in charge of keeping the Sviets under the control of Shinra. This is done through a programmed chip that is implanted into each experiment in Deepground. And through those chips, Lady Patricia gives the restrictors, the overseers of Deepground, the ability to immediately take control of and subdue the body of any Deepground soldier. This system is implemented in order to keep Deepground soldiers from ever being able to challenge the restrictors, thus allowing them to always have the power needed to stay in control of any situation. So know that while the restrictors have this level of control over every Deepground soldier through these chips and are powerful soldiers in their own right, they need this power in order to subdue not only disobedient Deepground soldiers, but also Deepground soldiers that are more powerful than they are. The only ones notably able to even come close to resisting the chip's power are Vice and Nero. That while the chip effectively stops them in their tracks, they are able to resist this power much more effectively than anyone else. For this reason, the restrictors also take extra precaution with Nero and Vice by restraining them in different parts of Deepground. Most notably, Vice's throne room at the center of Mako Reactor 0, the reactor located just below Shinra HQ. This will be very important to know for later. I want to very quickly mention that all of the information I just gave you, which is from Dirge of Cerberus lore, is all featured in Vice's official bio in Intergrade, that he is the Emperor of Deepground, but chained up to his throne. That alone gives us a lot. Square is very aware of what is happening when in Final Fantasy VII's lore, and are staying true to that. Also, this starts giving us an accurate time frame of events, as we also know from Dirge and subsequently the intermission bio, Vice is not to be freed from his shackles unless he is being experimented on. And he is not permanently freed from these shackles until after his rebellion is complete, which means that the restrictors are still in control of Deepground in intermission. But there is still more to get from the story than just this piece of info. So, with all of these safety measures in mind, what exactly does Vice and the other colored Sviets do to overthrow the restrictors, thus gaining their freedom? This is where the plot of Dirge of Cerberus's multiplayer comes in. One of the colored Sviets, Shulk, uses the ability S&D, an ability that allows somebody to explore the worldwide network, essentially the internet in Final Fantasy VII, in the form of a virtual reality. Shulk is then able to tamper with chips before they are implanted into new experiments to give certain newly instated Deepground soldiers a defective chip. This step allows certain new recruits, i.e. your player character in the multiplayer story, the ability to fight against the restrictors without being affected by the restraints of the chip through Patricia. Then, in order to incentivize your player to kill the restrictors, Shulk once again uses her ability of SND, which also has the ability to download and create memories inside of the minds of others, implants memories into your character. These memories being of traumatic events that leads the player to believe that the restrictors killed their family. This is done not only to ensure that the new recruits are willing to do whatever it takes to kill the restrictors, it also removes any focus of suspicion from the other colored Sviets and keeps it all on them. It's important to keep in mind that while Shulk gets to access Lady Patricia by the restrictors frequently, as she is often called upon to fix any errors that occur with her programming, Shulk isn't able to modify any chips that have already been installed into older Deepground soldiers, like the ones in Vice and the other colored Sviets. She is only able to modify them before they are implanted. So know that in order to truly be free from the control that the restrictors have over Deepground, Patricia is not the issue. The issue is the power that the chips give the restrictors. So as long as every single restrictor is alive, then there is no way for the Deepground soldiers, the colored Sviets, or even Vice to truly free themselves from the control that Shinra has over them. This is a key reason why the colored Sviets' plan is executed in such a particular way. All in secret and all very carefully. All in an attempt to not raise any awareness of the plan to the restrictors. The restrictors at certain points in the story do realize that there are some defective chips in certain recruits, but in these instances, restrictors just kill these defects. That means that even if one of Shulk's mind-warped Deepground soldiers are successful in staying alive long enough to make them a candidate for the rest of the colored Sviets' plans, the restrictors will murder them without a second thought if they found out that they have defective chips. This is just further highlighting how delicate and painful this process is. A process that the colored Sviets even complain about at the end of the multiplayer, as there is just so much that can go wrong. So during the Dirge of Cerberus multiplayer story events, the player assumes the role of a new recruit for Deepground, in which the player is forced to take up arms against his fellow recruits and fight to climb the ranks. This character, having worked his or her way up to earn the title of a Sviet, is granted the opportunity to fight Vice. An opportunity given to anyone who earns this ranking. During your challenge of Vice, the player with their unrestricted will, through their defective chip and their false drive to rebel against the restrictors, help Vice murder a single restrictor by distracting him long enough for Vice to make a move against him. This is the first instance of Deepground's rebellion killing a restrictor. This moment, which will be important to keep in mind for the timing of intermission. This is where the full extent of the plan is explained. The plan here is to take the armor of the recently slain restrictor and then put one of Shulk's puppets, who is also a Sviet, into the restrictor's armor. This Sviet is to then assume the identity of the restrictor that was slain. This accomplishes something very important. This allows for Vice's rebellion to go undetected by the other restrictors. And while you may think the restrictors would sniff out the ruse immediately, restrictors are actually unaware of each other's identities. We also never see more than one restrictor at a time, which indicates perhaps that they aren't even really around each other as far as we can tell, or they just operate separately from one another. For that reason, this kind of disguise is almost impossible to notice. This allows Vice, with the help of the colored Sviets and the mind-controlled Sviets, to repeat this plan over and over to pick off every single restrictor, all without alerting not just the restrictors, but the Deepground scientists and Shinra to Vice's rebellion. And when I say repeat the plan, I mean from top to bottom repeat. Create the defective chip, get that Deepground soldier to Sviet ranking, then have them fight Vice under the watch of a restrictor, then kill that restrictor. Keep in mind that this process takes quite a bit of time as it is, but is getting more and more time consuming. It's highlighted by a restrictor that as the experiments in Deepground get stronger, the Sviet program is getting more and more rigorous, meaning less of a chance for a defected, chipped soldier to rise in the ranks. All of these factors slow the process of the rebellion. So, what is the end goal of the plan? The end goal here is to do this with every single restrictor in Deepground. And once the elimination of all the restrictors is accomplished in secret, Vice and all of Deepground will be able to be freed. If anyone were to become aware of this coup, it would end in the death or termination of all the Spiettes involved, and or the restrictors putting yet another safety measure to prevent something like this from ever happening again. So, though this painful method of slowly replacing the restrictors is tedious and time-consuming and frustrating to explain, this is the only means for Vice and the rest of the rebellion to achieve this plan. The virus. So that's all, right? That's all there is to it. If you thought that this was the end of the madness that is this convoluted plot, then you are absolutely dead wrong. Because if Vice and his fellow Spiettes do end up killing all of the restrictors, there is still one particular safety measure that the restrictors have over Deepground, and that is the virus inside of Vice. Yeah, this virus is only triggered when the entirety of the restrictors are killed. Once this happens, this final safety measure will kill Vice in 3 days. That sounds like a trap card in Yu-Gi-Oh! As stupid as this might sound to you, this one safety measure is brilliant on account of how much damage this would do. The obvious being that Vice is clearly such a liability for shit to go wrong that they took every precaution needed for him to never be allowed to escape. If he ever were to, it would end very poorly for everyone involved. So even if this were to happen, they would still be okay as a group, right? The most relevant reason for this being kind of brilliant, Vice is actually integral to the unity of Deepground and the rebellion. He is massively respected by the Deepground soldiers, meaning that even if they did manage to kill each restrictor and free themselves from Shinra's control, Vice's death would be a major blow to the unity of Deepground. I will state that there isn't any other person to take his place either. Nero, Rosso, and Azul are all entirely mad, and Shulk is not respected by any of the other members of the Spiettes, meaning that the only sane person keeping the ship afloat and keeping them from all killing each other is Vice. He, ironically, is the stabilizer. Without him, it would be absolute fucking chaos. So, what does Vice do about the virus? Well, the virus has no inherent cure. So, what this forces Vice to inevitably do is use the ability in which he has acquired from Shulk to go into S&D. Yes, Vice has the power of all of the other colored Spiettes. He is able to duplicate himself like Rosso. He is able to use S&D like Shulk. And very presumably, he has the abilities of Azul and Nero, which you best believe that in his fight in Intergrade, you're going to be seeing all of these abilities. I'm calling it right now that you're going to see all of the colored Spiettes abilities being utilized in their fullest by Vice. Now, just know that the activation of this virus doesn't happen until much later in the story. And when I say much later in the story, I mean around the time in which Dirge of Cerberus takes place, 3 years after the events of OG. So, as we know, Deepground continues within Intergrade's story just as it has been described here. A lot of people are using S&D as a signifier of the time and event when Vice has activated the virus. This is false. While this could be seen as an indicator for that event, it's important to keep in mind that Vice has had this ability of S&D prior to the virus being triggered. So, the most likely reason that we see Vice forming himself in the battle simulation is that he simply is using S&D to gain access to fight whoever is in there currently. As we know from Dirge of Cerberus' online multiplayer mode, Weiss, unless he is partaking in an experiment, is always shackled to his throne in Mako Reactor 0. And because of this, the only way in which you would ever fight him is if you were in Deepground in his throne room. So, in conclusion of this segment, Weiss is still alive and actively seeking out his plans to kill each of the restrictors. The restrictors are still in power, meaning by the time of Intergrade's story, Shinra still has its hold over the Deepground soldiers. Now that we have the context of the entirety of the Deepground story, all that is left to do is look at the pieces of this story in its context and apply it to Remake. The first thing that I stated at the beginning of this conversation was that the events of Dirge of Cerberus' multiplayer take place around the time of the events transpiring during Remake. And this is true. Not only is it proven from Weiss's imprisonment mentioned in his bio, we also have an indicator in the multiplayer and in intermission of the exact timing to place exactly what point these events in Yuffie's story are unfolding, and that is with Weiss's swords. In the ending of the Dirge of Cerberus multiplayer, Weiss is set to challenge your player, as well as Rosso and Azul. It is at this time that Weiss mentions that he would like to try his new toys. These new toys being the signature Heaven and Earth gunblades that Weiss is known for. As we see from Intergrade's trailer, Weiss does have these swords with him. And since we can account for the period of time of these two events, this allows us to identify that Intergrade is taking place after the DOC multiplayer. So this gives us the only time frame in which we can expect intermissions events in Deepground to be taking place, and that is during Deepground's efforts to kill the remaining restrictors, having already killed one, but seemingly having not killed them all. Hence, Weiss's swords in Intergrade. So, what is the importance of time and place? Well, that is because we can now accurately talk about who we might see in Deepground other than Weiss. As Nomura stated in an interview after the trailer's release, Weiss is not the only one we should be expecting to see, and is not Yuffie's final boss. Looking at Dirge of Cerberus' interviews, there was a strong desire from the team developing Dirge of Cerberus for the Spheats to be in some way, shape, or form in other Final Fantasy VII games. And while back then there wasn't an opportunity to do so, there is now. There are also other pretty certain indicators that Remake is already setting this up, and some other smaller details already in the Intergrade trailer. So I will go over each Deepground character in no particular order and why they are the most likely to appear in the story from a lore perspective. And while I would like all of them to be featured in some way in intermission, Lord knows Square has been literally giving me more than I can even ask for at this point. I am just making sure that if they don't all appear, which they should, at least we can determine the most likely reasoning as to have not, and in turn, who would be the most likely. The characters. Azul the Cerulean. Azul the Cerulean, a colored Spheat who has been put through the metamorphosis experiments, has a reference in the segment of Deepground in Remake already. This reference was previously discussed on another one of my videos, but just for the context, the horns on the Type 0 behemoth that you fight in the Deepground segment of Remake are in fact the same horns found on Azul in his behemoth form, Arch Azul. So rather than this reference just being a nod, I think it's foreshadowing. As we know from the Dirge of Cerberus multiplayer, Azul is one of the few colored Spheats that isn't restricted to certain areas of Deepground. Those who would be are Rosso, Weiss, and Nero. And it is for this reason that I think that he would be the most likely to appear in the story, as he is the one that has the most presence in the base game so far and enough access in Deepground. Shulk. Shulk might seem like a weird choice, as there is nothing that alludes to her presence in the main story of Remake. She, however, more than any other colored Sviet, is allowed a wider access to Deepground. Her skill set is used for required maintenance through all of Deepground. It is for this reason that her presence in any part of Deepground is more certain than any other colored Sviet. She also can monitor most of the activity that takes place in Deepground. Through her S&D ability, she can literally see out of every helmet worn by the Deepground soldiers. I would also like to mention once again that we see Weiss use his power of S&D in the Intergrade trailer, and the only way in which Weiss would have this ability is through Shulk being present somewhere in the story. So, not only is she already alluded to through this ability, her level of access in Deepground makes her a higher probability than anyone else but Azul. I would also like to take the time to mention some looser connections. Sonon makes mention of a sister, one that is seemingly lost. This story directly mirrors another character in the compilation in particular, and that character is Shalua, a character that is also seeking out her sister, as she was taken at a young age by Shinra to Deepground. This sister ends up being Shulk, so perhaps this story is being used to further connect Sonon to the plot of Intermission and the party's connection to Deepground through this kind of rewrite. But because of how much of these games haven't been touched in regards to the continuity, which is a surprise for me to even be able to say that, I do think that this makes this connection unlikely, but an interesting idea nonetheless. Another particular thing I would like to mention is that Shulk was recently announced as a guest character in another Final Fantasy game. Shulk was recently announced for Opera Omnia, a mobile game featuring the entire range of Final Fantasy's universe. This character is not well liked, and her appearance in any game is almost too odd to account for. But knowing that she might be coming up in an upcoming game, there might need to be some context given for players. This would provide an avenue for that. I would also like to stress Azul and Shulk actually throughout most of the story of Dirge of Cerberus are teammates. So the pairing of these two, I think, would make them also extremely likely. It's almost, I almost want to say that this is 100%. Like, I'm doubling down. Azul and Shulk for sure are gonna be in this DLC. Like, I'm calling it now. I don't even care. I'm calling it. The Restrictors. This might not be the most likely pick to anyone, simply because they are one of the most unknown groups in the entirety of Final Fantasy VII. But it's important to know that most activity in Deepground, especially if there is anything involving the colored Sviets, you can be sure that it is overseen in some capacity by at least one restrictor. If there is any activity that would take place in Deepground, any form of intruder, they would be the ones accompanying the experiments to engage the target, not to participate. Don't get me wrong, the restrictors, while they seem to enjoy killing as much as the next crazy in Deepground, they also enjoy watching those in Deepground fight to the death. So, while you may not fight one, it's not outside of the realm of possibility that one would be around. It would maybe even be an interesting idea to have Yuffie and Sonon kill a couple restrictors. That would definitely help Weiss finish the rebellion a little sooner than usual, but that's just speculation. Just a thought. Rosso the Crimson. I'm gonna be straightforward with you guys. Rosso is unlikely from a lore perspective, as there is not a lot of access that this character has to Deepground, as she is bloodthirsty in ways that make her very dangerous to anyone around her. But there is a moment in Dirge of Cerberus that is slightly suspicious. That might be something that makes her a candidate. And that is because it involves Yuffie and a curious observation. Shout out once again to Miss Winerib for this find, because it's pretty remarkable. In this clip, Yuffie saves Vincent from Rosso just having torn the proto-materia out of him. Yuffie shows up to save the day, blinds Rosso, and then vanishes. To which Rosso says this.
Wutai, flee!
That is a pretty interesting indicator right there. Now, from what I understand, Rosso, and generally speaking, the Deepground army, are very aware of the powers that be during the time of Dirge of Cerberus. As Rosso mentions, the World Regenesis program, the group combating Deepground, and the group dedicated to helping protect the planet, and the organization that Yuffie is a part of in Dirge of Cerberus, she seems very aware of them. This dialogue in which Rosso speaks of the WRO takes place very early on in the game, which clarifies Deepground's awareness of that group. But this clip being so specific to Yuffie and the mention of Wutai has me very fucking suspicious that maybe these two characters may have come into contact before. This is highly unlikely, as I am sure there is a reasonable explanation for this in Dirge of Cerberus, other than what I have already mentioned, but this is one possibility for it. And honestly, if we're strictly speaking outside of the lore, Rosso is Nomura's favorite character from Dirge of Cerberus. It's his favorite design. And he said that it is the one that felt the most part of the Final Fantasy VII universe out of all of the other Sphettes, which does make her, just by default, a good choice, but again, from my perspective, a least likely option. Nero. This character is a wild card for me, as we know that Nero in DOC's multiplayer is literally stuck to a giant slab in a basement in Deepground, and this pretty clearly excludes him, as we only see him attached to this thing in the multiplayer and nowhere else. But the likelihood of his appearance is not necessarily determined by this. Nero's power allows him to move freely through the world of Final Fantasy VII on a whim, teleporting insane distances to wherever he chooses, and he is able to feel the presence of intruders that enter his brother's throne room. So, if I'm being honest, the likelihood of his appearance is only determined under the circumstances of his brother's safety, as this attachment to his brother might give him the strength to unshackle himself. But because he does not appear in the DOC multiplayer scene, moving around freely at any point, he is on the lower end for me. Argento would be so cool to have in the game. She is also a colored Spheette, and the reason I haven't mentioned her in any detail is because she doesn't really have that much of a presence in the main story for DOC, but there are things about her that make her worth mentioning. Other than the fact that she looks like a complete badass, but just know out of all of the characters I have mentioned that are colored Spheettes, she is the least likely, in my opinion, to appear, but a character that I would absolutely love to see. Argento created Vice's swords, as well as made Shulk's sabers. The only thing worth mentioning here is that she just vanishes after the DOC multiplayer, and doesn't show up in Dirge of Cerberus at all. This character literally disappears, and there is no mention as to what happened to her. I would love to have some sort of resolution to this character, but as she is already in the running for being the most obscure character on the planet in regards to Final Fantasy VII, it seems unlikely. Her headdress, however, does have me suspicious and theorizing, but nothing to report on that yet. Now, all of those characters being accounted for, their likelihood of appearance, we are getting to the really good stuff. Why did I not include Vice on this list? Well, as I said at the beginning of this video, I was certain that Shinra HQ would be featured in Yuffie's chapter, but not in the way that you would expect. While there is a lot to account for with Avalanche HQ's appearance at the end of the game, we know that Yuffie's story takes a drastic turn at some point during her mission to get the materia from Shinra HQ. This drastic turn seemingly being the arrival in Deepground, but the trailer reveals a very telling location. In the background of the shot in which Sonon and Yuffie confront the Deepground soldiers for the first time, we see a large dome structure behind them. This dome seems to be a direct reference to a vital area found in Dirge of Cerberus, the entrance into Vice's throne room, the heart of Mako Reactor Zero. And for those who don't know, Mako Reactor Zero sits right below Shinra HQ. This indicates that if these two structures are in fact the entrance to Vice's throne room, then Yuffie and Sonon are not just in some random lab for failed test subjects. They are in the heart of the beast, Mako Reactor Zero. This one piece of evidence makes Vice's presence in the story out of all of the characters in Deepground the most likely. Not just as a battle, but as a larger element of Intermission's story. And with the identification of this location, we can say for certain that within the 2 chapters that we know make up Intermission, Yuffie's episode starts in Sector 7 and then goes to Mako Reactor Zero. This is where we are going to finally go over Intermission's plot beats, in which I will finally explain how I think the story of Intermission and the story of Remake connect to create Dirge of Cerberus inside of the story of Intermission. Intergrade is defined by a passing into another form, by a series of occurring in between events. This is what defines all that we have talked about so far, a series of events that overlay one another. Just as the story of Avalanche HQ and the story unfolding in Remake, both coming together in the final conflict at Shinra HQ. If this is the fundamental idea of Intergrade, then how does Yuffie's story integrate with the larger events unfolding? Where does her story connect? We know that for the majority of the trailer, Yuffie remains out of touch with Barret and the party, and that is because of the timing of Yuffie's arrival in Deepground. The only real time in which she can bridge her story into the main one is through the events unfolding in Shinra HQ. As the moment in which Yuffie arrives, there are only 3 days left before Remake ends. In Remake, these days are accounted for. Day 1 in Remake, the first day begins with Cloud meeting Aerith and Barret's party being located by Don Corneo's men. The ending of this day being Sector 7 Platefall. Day 2 in Remake, the morning after Platefall, Cloud and the party wake up in Sector 5. That night, the infiltration of Shinra HQ begins. These events leading to the highway chase. Day 3 is the day in which the game concludes. With this one piece of information, we can now talk about the entirety of Intergrade and the theories that follow. Intermission's plot points already account for the first day and most of Day 2. Day 1 in Intermission. The first day begins with Yuffie showing up in Midgar, and the day ends with the train out of Sector 7 to the upper plate to Sector 0. Around the time of Platefall, and the event in which they end up in Deepground. Day 2 in Intermission. This day starts with an undetermined time in Deepground and the events that surround Mako Reactor Zero. So if this is the timing of both stories, we still have the night of Day 2 all the way up to Day 3 to account for with Yuffie's story, in which her story will finally merge with the events of Remake. And unironically, both parties are in the perfect places in which their stories can connect, in which Yuffie and Cloud's parties are literally right above and right below each other. Cloud is in Shinra HQ, and right below them, in Mako Reactor Zero, Yuffie is in Deepground. How do these stories find their way to each other? This will blow your mind, now and later. In Dirge of Cerberus, Vincent Valentine and Yuffie, with the WRO, work together to infiltrate Midgar in order to get to Deepground. Vincent is told to access a private elevator. This elevator is used specifically for President Shinra's use. This one private elevator connects his floor directly to Deepground, meaning that both Yuffie and Cloud in Remake have this one elevator that connects the areas that they are in at this very moment in time located in. So, what is the only elevator in the entire game that we know is already directly connected to the president's floor? The elevator in the fucking drum. The drum, the secret laboratory that not only houses Genova, but also houses the failed experiments that we know also appear in Deepground. A floor that is only given access to those who have the same amount of access to Deepground, and is a private access elevator that only the president has access to. Do you want to know where the elevator leads in Dirge of Cerberus? It leads to a room filled with materia encased in glass. This is the entire reasoning for Yuffie to infiltrate Midgar to begin with, to gather materia. You literally see it displayed in 2 rooms, plenty of it. Now there are some that might be curious as to what the ultimate materia might be, and we will elaborate on that in just a bit. This elevator accounts for every event that follows. Every event. The finale of Intermission. In Remake, Cloud arrives at the elevator, who is following the purple pools of blood left by Genova. These footsteps lead to President Shinra's office, to which the steps end. This indicates that Genova is already in this room, just not visible. President Shinra is nowhere to be seen, but a large window is broken. This leads us outside of President Shinra's office, to which we find President Shinra dangling off a ledge. The president is saved by Barret, only to be stabbed, and Genova Dreamweaver is fought and defeated. Cloud and the party make their way outside. This helicopter signifies that it is making another round to search for friendlies. The collection of these events and their timing tell me that the first search for friendlies made by Avalanche HQ with this helicopter, a plan that is on the whiteboard in Intermission, began and was accomplished before Cloud and his party arrives, meaning that Yuffie has already used the elevator, been in President Shinra's office, and has already been picked up by Avalanche HQ and has left Shinra HQ, meaning that all of the events, all of them, which lead up to Cloud's arrival have already been affected by Yuffie's story directly. The elevator that Cloud takes with the party being the same one as the one from the drum takes Yuffie and Sonon from Deepground to the top floor. So, what exactly happens then after Deepground's events occur? What would happen in President Shinra's office? Now we know at this point, Yuffie and Sonon are familiar with the plan made by Avalanche HQ to not kill the president, but rather flush the president out instead. The state in which we find him suggests that something is going against this plan. So, knowing that Yuffie and Sonon have already arrived here, and the conflicting feelings in which Sonon imparts onto Yuffie earlier on the train ride, who is the most likely to do something about President Shinra? I don't know. Maybe the guy who is out for revenge. However, revenge doesn't seem to be the only thing motivating Sonon to do this. As we know, Avalanche HQ's overall goal is Rufus's goal. The end result for Rufus is to kill his father in order to assume power, meaning that at some point in Rufus's plan, there needed to be someone with the task of killing him. Auto-Ignition, someone who is my self-proclaimed Rufus lore master, and someone who has been talking about all of what I have mentioned in this video in regards to Rufus with me since we first met. She made this observation to me, that Sonon would be the only character out of the entire group introduced to us to carry out that specific goal. This would not only make Sonon one of the final antagonists of the game for Yuffie, but fully explain the extent of Rufus's original plan. As we know, President Shinra is killed by Sephiroth, something that Rufus could not have orchestrated or accounted for. The only avenue in which Rufus would have any power or control to execute this plan is through Avalanche HQ. This would expand several key characters' roles and relationships into the future of Remake, specifically with Rufus and Heidegger. Now, the original development of Wutai's involvement in Remake painted the relationship with Avalanche and Wutai as a manifestation of a scheme of Heidegger's. But as we know of Heidegger in Before Crisis and in Remake, he tends to be constantly playing with the horrible cards that are dealt to him, terrible situations that he creates or puts himself into, and tries to spin these events and just this straight up bad luck in a way to favor his image. This is always done in order to reflect positively in the eyes of his superior, President Shinra. As noted several times throughout Remake, Heidegger fails and exclaims that not only were these good things, they actually go better than he originally planned. This guy is just such an idiot. In the scene in which President Shinra asks for a progress report before their meeting in Shinra HQ, Heidegger seems to be unable to look at President Shinra in the eye when asked about the Wutai propaganda. This is indicating to me that Heidegger is up to something, and that Heidegger might already be aware of Sonon and Yuffie in Shinra HQ, and rather than the Wutai propaganda being some insanely genius plan manifested by this idiot, Heidegger became aware that Wutai was with Avalanche. Then, once he did, he twisted it to seem as though all of this was an intentional plan. This could have been even in regards to the warehouse, as Sonon, knowing that he has been with Avalanche HQ up until this point, might have been a key instrument in how that mission was successfully accomplished. And as we know from what the troopers say at the line, that none of the warehouse events are to be disclosed to anybody but this specific troop, as to not reflect poorly on Shinra, aka Heidegger. Now, I'm not saying that Heidegger and Rufus are working together. Actually, quite the contrary. I think now that Heidegger has become aware of Wutai and Avalanche, Rufus becomes irritated that Heidegger might find out that he is in fact the one pulling the strings, the one who orchestrated the entirety of Avalanche from the beginning, as well as Wutai. This is why at the end of the game, Rufus and Heidegger's relationship is disjointed. Not only is it for the fact that Heidegger is trying to keep his role as second in command to the president, and his new superior Rufus is just not biting, it also might be because Heidegger has stumbled into being one step away from finding Rufus out. This is a relationship that seems to be set up to develop in this direction further in Remake's future, and Sonon being tasked to kill Shinra would be a direct avenue for that relationship, along with Heidegger's very limited awareness of Avalanche and the situation. But as we know, the president is still alive. Why is that? This is because of Yuffie. This is where Yuffie's character would most likely be developed. Yuffie isn't a murderer. All she wants is the best for Wutai and her nation to be restored. Sonon wants revenge, to which I see two ways in which this event can play out. Either Sonon attacks the president, to which Yuffie convinces or stops Sonon from finishing the job. As to her, this would most likely not be the way to change things for the better, or a way to get Sonon's sister back, which we know Sonon has already lost her, or Sonon at this point in the story, as most people have already imagined, is dead, and it is Yuffie who is driven to the point in which she desires President Shinra's death. But with these avenues explored, they both have the same conclusion: Yuffie's character development. As many people see Yuffie's character in the original as the weakest out of the entire party. Something to show her resolve and commitment to what she believes in gives her ample character development in order to grow into the next game. This is already being softly hinted at with the costume that Yuffie wears. Though many people have pointed to the Mog outfit being a direct tie to her costume in Dirge of Cerberus, the original costume isn't of the Moogle. Why? This change seems to be in association with Avalanche HQ's use of the Moogle throughout Intermission, and is also something that is directly associated in Remake to children, and this is something that the compilation does in several ways as well. In Advent Children, the use of the Moogle doll is to convey that the events that have transpired in the world at that time to have not only created a feeling of hopelessness in adults, but also children. It is this loss of innocence that the Moogle signifies in the movie, and is something I think that plays directly back into the use of the Moogle in Intergrade. What is Yuffie's development in On the Way to a Smile? She wants to find a cure for geostigma, as Yuffie finds out that geostigma is directly caused by people losing the will to live. It is this want of Yuffie to help all of those affected that leads her to reunite with Avalanche in Advent Children. It is this expression of good that Yuffie's design in Advent Children even conveys, as the party wears pink ribbons to reflect Aerith's presence. While everyone wears one, Yuffie wears several. This is what encapsulates this character's desire to restore happiness and life back into the world. The reason I bring this up is because this same arc is also being reflected in the other title of Intermission, episode Yuffie. This same naming convention is the same one that On the Way to a Smile uses for each character's story. This to me signifies a relationship between what Yuffie's journey is in Intermission is a direct reflection of her journey in On the Way to a Smile, similarly to how we have talked about with other characters in Remake. This I expect to tie back into Yuffie's promotional image for Intergrade, as people have pointed out that this image is a one-for-one of Yuffie's same promotional art from the original game. Noticeably, Yuffie is still wearing the Moogle costume in this image. I do expect that we will be getting an image that removes Sonon and the Moogle outfit. Having not been able to save Sonon from the torment that the loss of his sister has caused, Yuffie reframes her understanding of her goals, and rather than her want to just restore Wutai, she is setting her sights on finding the right path to make things right in the world. This same arc also sets the stage for her to be on the same page with Cloud's party, as we know that Cloud and the party have committed to finding a new path to forge destiny anew. Yuffie having this same resolve at this moment, deciding to perhaps not kill the president, the man that has caused the most pain to Wutai, would set her up perfectly to integrate her character development with Cloud's party. What happens after that, I am not sure about, but the only thing I am certain of is that wherever Yuffie is going, it ultimately aligns with Day 3. But that isn't an easy thing to just say, considering how much leads up to that morning. Cloud's party ending up where they do on the other side of a much larger event, an event that could be completely disjointed from the time in which all of these events take place, meaning that for Yuffie to get to Cloud and the team, something major would have to intervene in order to show up. My guess, if this derailment would take place, it would only be caused by one thing, really: the Whispers. As we know, there are several instances with them in this moment that disrupt all of Midgar. The Whisper screams stretching out across the sky, the barrier they create around Midgar, and them exploding into dust are all moments in which the Whispers create some sort of massive shockwave. Perhaps Yuffie gets caught up in one of these instances somehow during her flight. Either way, I am calling it here that her story will connect with Cloud's party at the end of her DLC. To what end? I can only speculate. Now, I believe that we are done with the plot of Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. What exactly is left to talk about? In Vice's bio, there is a quote: "Let us raise the curtains in the beginning of what is called the end." This quote is a direct connection to one character in particular. The one who I have already said to be in the game is 100% showing up here. This line not only sets up for his inclusion, but very deliberately paints the line that, as we already know, what Remake is a sequel to Dirge of Cerberus and the entirety of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. And that, without you even fucking knowing it, everything I have talked about indicates to us that what Intermission is, unabashedly, is a remake of Dirge of Cerberus. Let's be honest, for anyone who has been following my content since the beginning, I have been talking about the inclusion of Genesis for quite some time. And the more Intergrade reveals, the more Genesis seems to become more likely. If I am honest, it almost seems as though there isn't any more mystery to this. It's just that blatant. But Intermission, through looking closer at the events that play out in that story, Remake has already told us that he was in the game, and everyone, including myself, just never knew it. Just to get started, the general feeling I had is that Intergrade had already jumped over Genesis into a ravine with the reveal of Deepground. Dirge of Cerberus single-handedly being the most disliked game in the compilation is presented front and center of the DLC and Remake. That is a pretty clear statement to the inclusion of not only the compilation, but it is also a clear indication of how far Remake was actually going to go. This reveal was then followed up with the unveiling of the actual most controversial villain of any Final Fantasy VII ever. If you thought Genesis was bad, then Vice is even worse. The twist of this villain is that bad. It's so bad. There is no getting around the fact that Vice is the farthest line that Final Fantasy VII could ever draw in terms of controversy in Remake's story. Other than the Nibelheim incident, but I think that one speaks for itself. And anything behind that line made by Vice is now completely wide open. So generally speaking, if you are not prepared for this concept being in Remake's lore already, it's already way more likely than it was before, and this next section will just clarify how involved he already is. Now, I do want to say that I was already pretty confident when Intergrade was announced that Genesis would be revealed, and that is because there was a lot in the base game and in the lore in order to set this up, evidence in Remake. The obvious being the mention of G-type cells by Hojo. These cells specifically reference the project that gave birth to Genesis and Angeal, as well as the failed experiments found in Deepground's existing area in the base game. These failed experiments have wing-like protrusions on their back, each one making up the same amount of joints that Genesis's wing has. So, right away, the combination of finding the failed experiments in this Deepground facility sheds a significant light on how canon Genesis already was in regards to Remake. This is because Genesis's birth is the core reason as to how Deepground came to be what it is, in every way. As I mentioned in the previous segment, Vice and the colored Sphettes are created from Genesis's genes, specifically, not G-type or S-type cells, meaning that his impact on Deepground goes back to its very inception, and it is the only way in which any of the Sphettes come to be as they are. He is the very foundation on which all experimentation is derived from. And with the appearance of Vice and the other creatures resembling the other colored Sphettes, as well as the failed experiments, it's just too blatant that this core lore is being deliberately highlighted. Do you know why I am so adamant about this? Is because Remake is doing a better job than Dirge of Cerberus ever did to highlight this connection. I am dead fucking serious. Dirge of Cerberus in no way, shape, or form designs any of the experiments or Sphettes with Genesis in mind. If it wasn't for the dialogue in DOC pointing directly at Genesis through the G reports and one NPC, you would never see any impression of Genesis design-wise. Remake is bringing this concept of Genesis cells to each design that Deepground experiments have. I mentioned that the Type 0 behemoth is a nod to Azul, but the game deliberately adds not only the horn of Arch Azul, but also added the same faceplate that the failed experiments have. Not only that, but used the same signature color for Genesis, red, in both of their designs. Now, there is a very clear reason why design elements were probably not included with the colored Spiettes, and this is mainly because Genesis wasn't even really conceptualized until the very last moment in Dirge of Cerberus' development. So, what did Final Fantasy VII Remake do? Remake saw its opportunity as it has seen every step of the way that we have talked about so far in each video and fleshed that concept out and did it beautifully. Remake is expanding on the concept of Genesis cells through the creature designs to give it proper context before Genesis is revealed. They are taking the opportunity to highlight this where they couldn't have before in Dirge of Cerberus. This isn't just some tossed together idea. This is a deliberate action from the developers to put the time and effort into making sure that they frame each piece of Dirge of Cerberus' lore together with clear intent. This will become unbelievably clear at the end of the video, to such a degree that it is unquestionable. The story reason for Genesis being included is the time of events unfolding in Remake. This is something I debated with myself constantly after finding so much of Genesis's presence littered throughout not only the world of Remake, but also in the themes in which Remake is taking from the compilation and adapting. The concept of fate, the concept of destiny, and the manifestation of wings being key elements that Crisis Core introduced and Remake was expanding on. All things connected to Genesis. If you want to deep dive into that particular subject, I recommend the Material Ultimania overview video that I made before this one. The question that presented itself, though, was even if Genesis did exist, what time would you introduce him? How could you do that without making his entrance a complete detour from the main story? Though many people point to Benora or other locations that we know Genesis to have appeared in, they all seemed either too jarring or too meandering of an idea to add to the main story of Remake. The only thing that made sense to me, back before Intergrade was even announced, was Midgar, and it was and is currently the only fitting location for his reveal. And that was because of the fact that this is where Genesis is during the events of Remake. He is literally underneath Midgar during the entirety of the events taking place. Up until he awakens in Dirge of Cerberus, it seemed that this reveal, however, with the conclusion of Midgar's segment of Remake, that this was not going to be possible. So, enter Intermission, the official name of Yuffie's chapter in Intergrade, a game not only depicting the full inclusion of Before Crisis and the full inclusion of Dirge of Cerberus appeared. And as we know, Genesis was given a second chance in order to fulfill some role in future events after the destruction of the two most powerful forces that function for that balance, Omega and Chaos. And that same moment, the ending of Dirge of Cerberus has already occurred. And you want to know why that is? In an interview with the Dirge of Cerberus creators, one comment in particular struck me, and that was in regard to the explosion left behind by Omega, in which Mako rains down over Midgar. It is this event that hints at a larger plot. As the Mako rains down onto Midgar, a particle makes its way to Shalua, who at the time is in critical condition. It is hinted here that her story would continue on. Not only that,
but 3 balls of purple glowing lights descend into Midgar as well. It is this same event that leads Vice to the caverns of Midgar. The developers highlighted that the entirety of the events depicted in this scene were meant to lead into a future story, a sequel to Dirge of Cerberus. Now, as we have talked about, the entirety of each event integrates themselves into each other's story that is playing out. And as I have already stated, there are several events that seem to be mirroring the compilation. So, when looking at Dirge, what is reflected in Intermission's story directly? Every single story beat from the last half of the game is happening in Intermission. As Yuffie's adventure into Intermission into Deepground mirrors the same sort of infiltration in which Vincent also infiltrates Deepground. The same mirroring of events transpire here. Omega's function being directly mirrored in the Harbinger, a planetary function of the planet that is in place to protect Destiny manifests, but its formation corrupted by a dark force. Upon its destruction, as well as Sephiroth's defeat, causes the Whispers to explode into gold dust and rain onto Midgar. A particle then floats into Biggs, the same way DOC ends with Shalua. What Intergrade is setting up for the events of Dirge of Cerberus to explore the concepts of Dirge of Cerberus 2 in Remake. I am not kidding. Yuffie's mission begins in Midgar in Sector 7, same as Vincent in Dirge of Cerberus. The mission of Yuffie, as highlighted by Cosmo Canyon Observatory, thank you, goes through the train graveyard, same as Dirge of Cerberus, as Vincent goes through the train graveyard. As Yuffie and Sonon get into Shinra HQ, Yuffie finds herself in Deepground, goes to Vice's throne room, and confronts Vice. Same as Dirge of Cerberus with Vincent. The defeat of Omega, the Mako rains down, awakening Shalua. The defeat of the Harbinger, the particles rain down, and the awakening of Biggs. And now, what is the final step of both of these stories? The awakening of Genesis. The same parallel of Mako raining onto Midgar is mirrored in Before Crisis, with Zirconiade exploding and the particles raining down onto Midgar, a planetary function of the life stream. All of these events mirroring themselves. And Square already gave us the final parallel in the secret cutscene. Genesis picks up Vice the same way, mind you, that Vice picked up Genesis at the end of Crisis Core to take him to Deepground, as translated by Audrey from the Japanese cutscene in Dirge of Cerberus' ending. Together let us raise the curtains on the final act, to which Vice says this in Intergrade's bio. Let us raise the curtains in the beginning of what is called the end, the final act, the final installment of the compilation, the beginning of what is called the end, the finale of DOC brought to a close in Remake, only for a new beginning, an untold story meant to act as a sequel to get its chance in the sunlight in the future installments of this new series of games, all being done with the awakening of Genesis. If there is an ending and it reveals Genesis, then you best believe it's going to very heavily mirror the events of DOC's secret trailer. So with all of this explained, we now have the clearest picture of events that we could possibly establish for the context of Intermission, leaving one major question left. What is the ultimate materia? Ultimately, what Intergrade's story does is define that each compilation game is being expanded on, as well as getting their sequels. Dirge of Cerberus with Yuffie's story in Deepground, The Harbinger, and Biggs being given life again through the Golden Dust, and Genesis's Awakening. Crisis Core with Zack being alive. Minerva and the concept of the goddess by highlighting the Whisper's defeat as golden particles instead of the iconic green Mako, which was featured in both Dirge and Before Crisis, and the concept of destiny being expanded on through the Whispers, Sephiroth's Wing, and the Harbinger. Advent Children with the rebirth of Sephiroth, and Before Crisis with Avalanche and Rufus, and the Harbinger again, as the Harbinger also mirrors the events of Before Crisis as well, as Zirconiade's defeat also caused an explosion over Sector 6's highway, the same way that the Harbinger does in Remake. Every single game that has existed in the compilation is getting some form of resolution and expansion. And it is this context that I think will define what the ultimate materia is. A materia that plays into one of these stories and will be featured as the materia in Intermission. This leaves us a few options of what this ultimate materia could be. What game's ending could be highlighted in the final moments of Yuffie's chapter, Zirconiade's materia. In Before Crisis, it is stated throughout the game that Zirconiade's materia is broken, and it not only allows its energy to be used by the person to give them more strength, but it also drains their life in order to sustain itself. However, Fajito, rather than implanting the materia into himself, as Elf had this done forcefully to her in Before Crisis, Fajito merged with the materia to turn into a creature. This form of Fajito bearing some foresight. Though Fajito was defeated and the materia broke, in the ending of Before Crisis, the materia was already broken before, meaning that if it still did exist, it could be used in the same way as before, to gift the person with powers beyond normal comprehension and potentially be used to burn the world. If a materia like this could be acquired by Sonon and Yuffie in Deepground, I could see this materia accentuating Sonon's already burning desire to destroy Shinra. This would also give him a much broader moveset than the one we experienced with him as our partner, Bahamut Fury. In Crisis Core, Bahamut Fury is a summon fought and acquired in the finale of Yuffie's side quest, this materia being one of several that Rufus points to for Godo with the information given to him. This connection between the unfolding events in Intermission and Crisis Core that we see established with Wutai make this summon a fitting conclusion to that story. I think that this would be just the cherry on top of everything that we have talked about. The other parallel that makes this more likely is that Genesis also summons a Bahamut in Crisis Core, as this is a parallel of events that has transpired several times already in the compilation, as well as in Remake. While this is slightly redundant, as we have already seen 2 Bahamuts already in Remake, I see it as a fitting inclusion to Genesis if they decide to do this. Keep in mind that Sonon could use whatever the ultimate materia is, as it's not necessarily the materia that needs to be important, but it's the motivation of the characters. That is what makes its use by Sonon, to me, a higher probability, and matters more than what the materia actually is. Genesis. I think this might be a more forward way of introducing Genesis, but it's worth noting. We know that Minerva in Crisis Core radiates strong summon signals. This is what creates the desire for not only Shinra to acquire it, but it also is something that Wutai remnants also seek out. However, as these groups continue into the cave that she is located in, the machines and creatures begin to become possessed and attack anyone trying to enter the cave. This to me could be very easily foreshadowed by the giant centipede creature that Yuffie and Sonon fight, or even an indication of how Heidegger becomes aware of the party even? Yeah, that's actually a fun thought. That might actually happen.
as there isn't much of a reason for this robot that seems to be more for construction to suddenly be attacking the party to begin with. I think that the ultimate materia could easily be Genesis alone, as we know that he obtains some sort of power through Minerva. The fact that there is just such a clear indication of him already makes this a high likelihood. With all of that being said, Remake has done more than just do justice to the lore. It is going to do it right. Just like we have talked about, Remake isn't just doing this for the sake of reliving a game that was widely unpopular. All of this is in an effort to give the ideas of each game the proper time, attention, and care that it deserved to begin with. All of this is not in service of just Dirge of Cerberus. It is the most disliked game in the franchise. It is to celebrate a legacy and to present it in a way that matters. That adds rather than subtracts. And for that reason, the possibility of what comes with this revelation, only time will tell. For instance, Rufus is involved in the WRO as well, as this is revealed in Dirge of Cerberus, as we will come to the same conclusion with his same involvement that he has with Avalanche in Remake. With that though, how many more parallels will there be? Will Kate Sith show up snooping around in Deepground? Is he the one who will ultimately help Yuffie and Sonon out of Deepground? Will we get G reports to unlock a secret ending? Argento, a completely unknown character from Dirge of Cerberus' multiplayer, has a similar headdress depicted in her design like Minerva's. She has one missing eye and vanishes without a trace after the multiplayer events. Her colored Sviet name, Argento, means silver, a color resembling the blurred lines of white and black. Will this mean anything going forward? Yuffie already has a very close connection to Zack throughout the compilation. I wouldn't be surprised. That's all I'm gonna say. I really wouldn't be surprised, especially after we just got an additional part of a summary saying that they couldn't hear the cries of your friends. Is that in regards to the Harbinger? Is that in regards to Yuffie's situation after this? Who the fuck knows? You think I'm going off the rails? Do you see what Square is doing? It's all fucking fair game, guys. Square has literally decided that they are going to just do whatever it takes to tell these stories right. And Square, I love it. This gives more weight to the idea that Shulk might be Sonon's sister, as the same trick was already pulled on Biggs. I don't think that they're gonna do it again with Shalua. This means that not only is Shulk's relationship to Sonon likely, it also clarifies the importance of the final conflict that we discussed earlier. In conclusion, this game tells the story of before Crisis, Dirge of Cerberus, and is now setting a course to explore an idea never explored before through the original story. And it's only gonna get more exciting from here. All I know for certain is Rufus will be revealed, Genesis will be revealed, and the parallels with every compilation game will deepen throughout this game and subsequent releases. This video took way too long to make. Ultimately, I am glad I waited and took my time because I think all of this ended up being so much more fun for me to talk about. I will be focusing on Twitch while filming some new videos that I have already written, and we'll be streaming Intergrade as well when that comes out, so I'm very excited to get to that and see how much of this I'm right and wrong about. For those who just want to support me more than you already are by just watching, please subscribe to the channel. It makes me feel good, and it helps me out at the same time. If you want to go one step further than that, which is already asking a lot, consider checking out my Patreon, where you can get some sneak peeks at what I am working on before it comes out. I would like to go ahead and mention Schrodinger's baby seal. This man kept my head down for a lot of this. He helped me talk things over and go over not only ideas, but just the script in general. So for doing all of that and just being a really great and awesome friend, I really appreciate it. Also, you guys have been asking me to talk to so many different Final Fantasy VII creators,
Well, Schrodinger's got you covered, and he and I have sat down with multiple other creators talking about theories of Final Fantasy VII, and I highly recommend anybody who is interested in those epic crossover events that you should just check out his channel because they're all on there. I would also like to thank Auto Ignition. If you heard the name Rufus in this video, it's something that has come out of Auto's mouth and just has always been getting at me about this topic. Thank you to her for everything. And for MJ Gallagher. Mo was essential to getting so much of the details of DOC right, so I really appreciate his support and his help. I really appreciate the time that you guys give to watch these videos. Ever since I started this channel, I have been consistently overwhelmed and moved that you guys have not only been so passionate about the videos, but just so overwhelmingly supportive. And all of you guys are actually phenomenal. My Twitch fam, my Tatsu fam, my Final Fantasy VII fam, you are all fantastic. And I can't help but think that it's all just because of this game that I started doing this. And if I hadn't or had done something different, I would have just never made it to where I am now. So, to Final Fantasy VII Remake, happy birthday. It is also the anniversary of this channel. There's a lot of different things that I wanted to do with this video, but I feel like the only fitting thing for me to do was sort of encapsulate what got this channel started, which was a more video essay-like format. Thank you all for watching everything, really. I will see you guys all in the next